I'm quietly checking the historical record first, so the names, dates, places, and long investigative sequence remain accurate before the narration begins. The damp grass beside Russey's lane brushes your trouser cuffs as the Hall Mills case opens before us, beneath the low branches of an old crabapple tree in rural New Jersey. Settle into the quiet sound of my voice and let the file unfold without hurry. It is the morning of the 16th of September, 1922, and a pale warmth is beginning to gather over the abandoned Phillips farm. The ground smells of weeds, fallen fruit, and earth that has held the night's moisture. You stand, in imagination, a little way from the narrow lane, where wheel tracks fade into dust and the outskirts of New Brunswick give way to fields. The city is close enough for church bells and factory whistles, yet the farm feels removed from ordinary Saturday errands. Somewhere behind you, insects move through the grass with a dry, steady sound. Before us lies the first page of the Hall Mills case, still thin and almost weightless, before statements, clippings, and unanswered questions made it heavy. Two young people have come walking through this quiet place, following a route known locally as a meeting ground for couples seeking privacy. Raymond Schneider is 23, while Pearl Balmer is 15, and neither expects to become part of a mystery remembered for generations. As they approach the crabapple tree, they notice two figures resting beneath its branches. For a few uncertain moments, the stillness might resemble sleep, and you can imagine the pair slowing their steps as the morning suddenly feels more serious. The man beneath the tree is dressed with the care of someone accustomed to a pulpit, with his clothing still orderly and his spectacles nearby. The woman beside him also appears deliberately arranged, as though someone had wanted the scene to convey a private meaning. There is no need for us to dwell upon their injuries. It is enough to know that both are dead, and that the condition of the scene tells the arriving officials this was no ordinary accident. The man will soon be identified as the Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, rector of the Episcopal Church of St. John the Evangelist in New Brunswick. The woman is Eleanor Reinhardt Mills, a member of his choir and the wife of the church sexton, James Mills. Both have been missing since Thursday evening, the 14th of September. As you hold those names beside the quiet orchard, the Hall Mills case begins, not as legend, but as the loss of two familiar people from one small community. Around them are personal letters, some torn and scattered over the grass, their paper softened by the open air. A calling card bearing Edward Hall's name helps make identification easier, while other objects seem to speak of a meeting intended to remain private. The fallen crabapples give off a faint sweetness beneath the warmer morning sun. If you were the detective arriving now, you would want the whole place left untouched, each blade of grass preserved like a line of handwriting. That careful stillness does not last. Word moves quickly through nearby houses and along the roads toward New Brunswick, gathering curiosity as it travels. People begin walking and driving toward the Phillips farm, and their shoes press overlapping paths into the grass. You can hear the murmur growing beyond the tree, with automobile doors closing, voices passing names from person to person, and reporters asking questions before anyone has gathered the first answers. In 1922, a rural scene like this cannot be sealed with bright tape, photographed from the air, or recorded by a trained mobile laboratory. Investigators have cameras, notebooks, measuring tools, and the developing study of fingerprints, but their work depends greatly upon order and observation. Here, order begins slipping away almost immediately. You can feel the frustration in the old file, where later accounts describe visitors moving close, touching objects, and treating the ground as public ground. Some people reportedly take pieces of the scattered correspondence, while others search among the weeds for something worth remembering or showing at home. Branches of the crabapple tree are disturbed, and the soft soil receives so many footprints that the earliest ones can no longer be confidently separated. The scene gradually becomes a crowded outdoor room without walls. As you look across it with an investigator's patience, you understand how evidence can disappear without anyone making a deliberate effort to hide it, simply through carelessness. A further difficulty waits beneath the maps. New Brunswick lies in Middlesex County, where Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills lived, worshipped, and were first reported missing, but the Phillips farm rests just beyond the county boundary in Somerset County. Authority must therefore pass between officers whose habits, records, and responsibilities do not fit neatly together. You turn a map beneath the lamplight and trace that thin jurisdictional line, noticing how something nearly invisible on paper can divide the entire investigation. The bodies are discovered close to the world of New Brunswick, yet legally they belong to another county's inquiry. Officials from Middlesex begin asking questions because the missing people came from their city, while Somerset authorities must consider what occurred on their land. Messages travel by telephone and automobile, sometimes clearly and sometimes not. In the Hall Mills case, this division becomes one of the earliest reasons information settles into separate desks, separate memories, and separate piles of paper. Before we follow those papers, you might pause beside the two lives at the center of them. Edward Wheeler Hall is 41 years old and has served as rector of St. John the Evangelist since 1909. Parishioners know the cadence of his sermons, the shape of his clerical collar, and the measured sound of his footsteps through the church. At home he lives with his wife, Frances Noel Stevens Hall, in comfort shaped partly by the wealth and standing of her family. The rectory carries its own quiet textures, from polished furniture to rugs that soften the movement of servants through the rooms. Frances comes from a prominent local family, and her life has been protected by money, custom, and a name familiar in New Brunswick society. Her brothers remain close to her affairs. As you imagine the household on the evening Edward fails to return, you can almost hear a clock marking each quarter hour against an atmosphere of controlled concern. Eleanor Mills lives in a more modest world with her husband, James, and their children, Charlotte and Daniel. James serves as sexton at the same church, tending practical matters that continue whether the sanctuary is full or empty. Eleanor sings in the choir, where her voice has become part of the regular pattern of worship. Her home contains the ordinary sounds of family life, the movement of dishes, the rustle of clothing, and the small questions children ask when a parent is unexpectedly late. The relationship between Edward and Eleanor has developed through church life and music, and by 1922 it has become an intimate attachment preserved in letters. Those letters reveal affection, hopes, frustrations, and plans expressed in the private language of two people who believed paper could hold what daily life could not. You lift an imagined sheet carefully by its corners. The ink may be faded now, yet the human wish beneath it remains recognizable. For investigators, these letters offer both evidence and complication. They establish that Edward and Eleanor had reason to meet, but they do not explain who else knew where the meeting would occur. They suggest emotional pressure surrounding two marriages, though emotion is not the same as proof. As we sit with the Hall Mills file, we must keep that distinction close, because the newspapers will often write certainty where detectives possess only possibility. On Thursday, the 14th of September, the day passes through New Brunswick under late summer skies. Streetcars sound along their routes, Horses still share roads with motor cars, and shop doors open onto pavements warmed by afternoon sun. At St. John's, parish work follows its familiar rhythm. You can imagine sheet music resting on a stand, dust floating through colored light, and the church holding that cool mineral smell common to old stone and shaded wood. By evening, Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills have each left home. Their exact movements become the subject of repeated questioning, with times adjusted and recollections tested against clocks, telephone calls, and the statements of neighbors. Someone remembers seeing Eleanor walking. Someone else recalls a car or a figure near a corner, although recollection becomes less reliable as attention grows. You place each account on the desk before you, leaving space between what was observed and what was later assumed. Frances Hall says her husband went out after receiving or responding to a message connected with church business. James Mills understands that Eleanor has also gone out, though the ordinary explanations offered that evening will seem different once morning arrives without either of them. Neither household yet knows that both have traveled toward the same meeting. For now, there are only empty rooms, cooling lamps, and the increasingly noticeable absence of a familiar step. The night deepens slowly over New Brunswick, and the temperature eases as windows remain open to the September air. A telephone may ring more sharply after midnight, while every automobile heard outside can seem briefly significant. The families wait in different homes, separated by circumstance and social standing, yet joined by the same lack of information. As the detective beside the lamp, you know what they do not, though there is no comfort in possessing that later knowledge. By Friday morning, the 15th of September, concern has become inquiry. Frances Hall and James Mills make contact, comparing what they know and discovering that Edward and Eleanor are both absent. The connection between them can no longer be treated as a private suspicion alone. You can imagine the silence after their names are placed together, while a telephone receiver feels cool and slightly heavy in the hand. The search begins with conversation rather than a formal alarm. Questions first move through the places where either person might reasonably have gone. Friends, relatives, church associates, hospitals, and railway connections can all be considered, because adults sometimes leave for reasons not immediately understood. Yet the hours pass without a reassuring message. Each answer closes one small door while opening another. In patient detective work, this is often how uncertainty grows, not through one dramatic discovery, but through a sequence of calm and disappointing calls. The missing pair's relationship soon shapes the search, although those closest to them do not all describe their knowledge in the same way. Love letters have been exchanged, and there are reports that some people around the church understood more than they initially admitted. Privacy, loyalty, embarrassment, and class all influence the words given to investigators. As you read each statement, you notice how a witness may tell the truth narrowly, offering only the portion that feels safe to share. Friday passes, and still the Phillips farm remains unconnected to the disappearances. The crabapple tree stands beyond the city, with its branches lowering over the grass, while the lane receives ordinary traffic, and the fields keep their quiet. Whatever useful marks existed there are exposed to wind, dew, insects, and passing feet. You return to the map and sense the lost hours settling across it, because evidence changes even when no one is watching it change. When Raymond Schneider and Pearl Balmer find the pair on Saturday morning, nearly 2 days have passed since they left home. Raymond goes to alert the authorities, and the identities are established with unusual speed because the missing names are already circulating. News reaches the families, then the church, and then the wider city. Bells, Telephones and newspaper presses become part of the same expanding sound, while the quiet farm is drawn into public attention. The first officials face a scene already rich with suggestions. There are the bodies placed close together, the private letters, the calling card, and the absence of an obvious weapon. There are footprints, tire marks, and other disturbances whose original significance has become difficult to judge. You kneel only in imagination, careful not to touch the damp soil, and consider how every object seems meaningful when so little context has yet been secured. Photographs are made, but even a photograph can preserve confusion as faithfully as order. The camera records what lies before its lens, not what may have been moved earlier, removed by a visitor, or altered by the weather. Black cloth, glass, metal, and chemical plates belong to the working world of the period, and each exposure takes preparation. We wait with the photographer while the image gathers, knowing that the scene is already no longer entirely original. Medical examinations establish that the deaths were caused deliberately, and investigators begin considering when they occurred. The likely time points back toward Thursday night, when both Edward and Eleanor disappeared. Beyond that, the medical findings cannot reconstruct every movement under the tree with certainty. We can leave the clinical details folded inside their envelope, because the more useful question for our quiet inquiry concerns the people, vehicles, sounds, and decisions surrounding de Russey's Lane that evening. A timeline begins to form in pencil. Edward leaves his home, Eleanor leaves hers, and both travel toward a meeting place beyond the city. At some point later, nearby residents hear sounds they will describe differently when questioned. Cars may have been seen along the lane, though makes, colors, directions, and occupants vary between accounts. You draw a line beneath the times, then leave several blank spaces, because a responsible timeline must show what the file cannot supply. The investigators also collect letters from the scene and from places connected with Edward and Eleanor. These pages are read not as private expressions now, but as possible guides to motive, plans, and knowledge. The transformation is uncomfortable, and perhaps it should be. You can feel the thinness of the paper beneath your fingers, and you remember that words written for one trusted person are being examined by officials beneath hard office light. Some letters appear to suggest that Edward and Eleanor imagined a different future, though plans voiced in affection may not become practical arrangements. Detectives consider whether they intended to leave, meet briefly, or discuss some obstacle that had recently changed. Every phrase can be interpreted several ways. As we read slowly, we resist the newspaper habit of turning longing into a fixed itinerary, because emotion leaves traces that are real without always being literal. The relationship naturally directs attention toward both spouses, yet suspicion is not evenly distributed. James Mills lacks the wealth and social protection surrounding the Hall household, and he is questioned within a public atmosphere already eager for jealousy as an explanation. Frances Hall faces scrutiny of another kind, because her composure is interpreted by strangers who believe grief should follow one visible form. You note both errors in the margin, since neither poverty nor restraint can prove guilt. Frances tells officials about her movements on Thursday night and the following morning. Her brothers, Henry and William Stevens, also become important to the inquiry, as does a cousin, Henry de la Bruyere Carpenter. The Stevens family's social position gives the story the class contrast newspapers quickly understand how to sell. Yet at the detective's desk, names and inheritance must remain secondary to times, distances, corroboration, and physical evidence. William Stevens, commonly called Willie, lives within his sister's household and is known around New Brunswick as an eccentric figure. Henry Stevens is more independent and has a reputation as a capable marksman, a fact the press will later repeat until it seems more conclusive than it is. Carpenter belongs to the extended family circle. You write the 4 names in careful script, but leave the space beside each one free of judgment, because a file should begin with questions. Investigators need to establish where each person was on Thursday evening. This sounds simple when written in a later history, but the work itself is made of slow travel, repeated interviews, and memories attached to ordinary routines. A witness may recall dinner, but not its exact hour, or remember a telephone call without knowing whether the clock was fast. You listen for household noises, railway schedules, meals, visitors, and lamps extinguished at the end of the night. Henry Stevens says he was at Lavalette, along the New Jersey shore, many miles from the Phillips farm. Supporting witnesses are sought, and the distance becomes central, because any accusation must overcome the alibi with more than suspicion. The road between Shore and New Brunswick is not merely a line on paper. In 1922, it means travel time, road conditions, fuel, and the notice a journey might attract. We trace it slowly with one finger. Francis Hall's account receives similar attention, though the earliest questioning is later criticized as too deferential. Wealthy households can appear orderly, even when the people inside are distressed, and investigators entering them may unconsciously soften their manner. The quiet carpets, polished tables, and attentive legal advisors create a different setting from a farm lane or sexton's home. You sense how surroundings influence an interview before the first difficult question is even asked. This difference becomes part of the Hall Mills case almost at once. Some observers believe the Hall family is being protected, while others see only the caution required when evidence is uncertain. Rumor fills whatever space official statements leave empty. In boarding houses, shops, newspaper rooms, and streetcars, people compare versions with the confidence of those who will never have to present their conclusions to a jury. The city begins investigating in its own restless, unofficial way. Reporters arrive from New York and farther away, carrying notebooks, cameras, and a powerful appetite for detail. They discover a story containing a clergyman, a choir singer, secret letters, a wealthy widow, a modest household, and an orchard just beyond town. Editors understand its commercial shape immediately. As you hear the clatter of typewriters in a crowded room, you also hear the quieter difficulty facing detectives, whose uncertain facts must compete with finished narratives. Headlines make the case feel more settled than it is. A rumor printed in the morning can return as supposed public knowledge by afternoon, and a witness may then absorb details first encountered in a newspaper. Questions asked by reporters can shape later recollections, especially when payment or attention follows a vivid account. You place the clippings in a separate folder, useful for atmosphere and chronology, but dangerous when confused with sworn testimony. The Phillips farm itself becomes an attraction. Visitors travel to de Russey's Lane to stand beneath the crabapple tree, and vendors reportedly find opportunities in the gathering crowds. The grass is flattened further, the branches become familiar landmarks, and the private place turns almost festive in the most uncomfortable sense. We remain at the edge of that crowd, listening to shoes scrape the dry path, and understand how public fascination can consume the very scene it hopes will provide clarity. For the working investigators, every new visitor introduces another possible witness and another source of contamination. Someone remembers a parked car, another person recalls a light, and someone else becomes certain that a voice carried across the fields. Statements accumulate faster than they can be tested. You feel the paper stack rise beneath your hand, each page smelling faintly of ink, tobacco, and the warm machinery of offices operating beyond their usual hours. The absence of a firmly protected scene means detectives must rely heavily upon people, and people are the most changeable evidence in any old file. Memory is shaped by repetition, fear, affection, suggestion, and the natural wish to make an incomplete experience coherent. A person who heard one distant sound may later attach it to a particular minute. As we review these early accounts, we give each witness dignity, while still asking how much the recollection can safely carry. One account concerns a local farm woman named Jane Gibson, who lives near de Russey's Lane and raises hogs on her property. Newspapers will later give her a coarse nickname based upon that work, but we needn't use it as though it were her proper name. For now, she is simply Jane, a woman accustomed to animals, dark fields, and the night sounds surrounding her home. Her place in the Hall Mills file begins gradually, then expands with every telling. Jane says that on Thursday evening her dog barked and drew her attention outside. She had been troubled by people taking corn or chickens, and she believed a thief might be moving near her land. According to the account she eventually gives, she saddled or mounted her mule, Jenny, and followed movement toward the lane. You can hear the animal's measured steps, the leather shifting, and corn leaves brushing together in the darkness. Her later description places several people near the crabapple tree, with motor cars nearby and voices carrying across the field. She says she heard a woman call the name Henry and witnessed enough to connect certain figures with the deaths. Yet Jane does not immediately give investigators the complete version that will later become famous. The account develops over time, and its changing details will force every patient reader of the Hall Mills case to weigh memory against influence. You turn back to the earliest statements, where what Jane says is less definite and some crucial identifications are absent. Then you move forward through later interviews, watching names and actions become more precise. This does not automatically mean the entire account is false, just as confidence does not automatically make it true. It means the investigator must ask when each detail first appeared, who was present, and what information Jane could already have heard. Other witnesses offer fragments that seem to support parts of her story. People remember vehicles along the road, or Jane herself moving through the evening landscape, though agreement is never complete. Each fragment resembles a small piece from a different puzzle box, similar in color, but uncertain at the edges. We place them near one another without forcing them to join, while the office window cools and the smell of rain settles against the glass. But there is another detail waiting in the early file, one that seems almost too ordinary beside the public excitement. Investigators must determine how Edward and Eleanor reached the Phillips farm, since neither appears simply to have wandered there without purpose. Walking routes, streetcar lines, borrowed automobiles, and familiar meeting places all require attention. You open a local map, wider across the desk, smoothing its creases as the roads of 1922 spread quietly beneath your hands. Witnesses report seeing Eleanor on foot during part of the evening, moving with a destination in mind. Edward's movements are considered through the use of his automobile and the statements of people who may have seen him. The scattered accounts do not produce one clean route. Instead, they create several possible journeys through streets now altered by later construction, each dependent upon a clock, a glance, or the color of a passing car. Detectives revisit homes and businesses, asking the same questions in slightly different forms. What time did the church bell sound? When did the shop close? And was the road damp or dusty beneath the tires? These modest details can test a memory without confronting the witness directly. You sit beside the interviewer, hearing pencil move over rough paper, while an electric fan turns slowly and warm air carries the faint smell of carbon copies. The work is repetitive, and that repetition matters. A useful investigator does not seek only the exciting answer, but returns to the dull one until its boundaries are understood. In the Hall Mills case, however, public pressure rewards speed and certainty, while the evidence requires caution. We can almost feel those opposing forces in the old folders, one pushing each theory forward, the other asking everyone to wait a little longer. Days pass into weeks, and the farm changes with the season. Crabapples soften beneath fallen leaves. Mornings grow cooler, and the light fades earlier across the fields near de Russey's Lane. Investigators continue taking statements, while reporters keep the story alive across the country. You return to the same notebook, after dusk, its cover worn at the corners now, and notice that the central blank spaces in the timeline remain stubbornly open. The letters are studied again, searching for references to travel, fear, discovery, or an intended change in the relationship. Handwriting experts and fingerprint specialists become part of the widening inquiry, though the condition of the objects limits what can be concluded. A page handled by many people cannot easily speak with one clear touch. As you examine its surface beneath angled light, the paper shows folds, smudges, and the quiet damage caused by too much attention. Questions also surround what may have been removed from the scene before officials arrived. An expected letter, a missing item, or an object remembered differently can lead detectives through hours of comparison. Yet absence is difficult evidence, especially once crowds have crossed the ground. You close one envelope and open another, aware that the investigation is trying to reconstruct not only what was present beneath the tree, but what may no longer be there. By October, Jane Gibson's account has gained greater importance, and officials return to her repeatedly. Her home offers a different sensory world from the courthouse offices, with animal sounds outside, rough boards underfoot, and fields extending beyond the reach of indoor lamps. She describes the night, while listeners write quickly. We sit quietly among them, watching the details gather, and we keep one question near the top of the page. Why did her story become clearer only after so much time? There are reasonable possibilities on either side. Fear can delay a witness, particularly when wealthy or influential people seem connected to what she believes she saw. Repeated questioning can also sharpen genuine memory by providing structure. Yet attention, suggestion, and newspaper contact can reshape recollection just as easily, especially when a person senses that others value one version more than another. The patient detective must hold all these possibilities together without choosing too soon. Jane's mention of the name Henry draws attention toward Henry Stevens and Henry Carpenter, while her description of a woman points suspicion toward Frances Hall. Investigators compare her statements with alibis, road distances, and other sightings. The work should resemble careful weaving, each strand tested before it bears weight. Instead, the fabric often pulls unevenly, because some evidence has already been lost, some testimony conflicts, and public expectation tightens around the most convenient theory. A special state investigator becomes involved as pressure grows for decisive action. Grand jury proceedings follow, bringing witnesses into closed rooms where testimony is recorded away from the crowds. Outside, reporters wait for scraps of information and study faces as people emerge. You can imagine the courthouse corridor, its stone cool beneath hurried shoes, with cigar smoke hanging near the ceiling, and whispers passing along the wooden benches. Inside those proceedings, officials must decide whether suspicion has become strong enough for charges. A grand jury does not determine guilt, but asks whether sufficient grounds exist to move toward trial. In the autumn of 1922, despite the weeks of investigation and enormous publicity, that threshold proves difficult to cross. We turn the pages slowly, feeling how much activity can accumulate around a case without producing dependable proof. No indictment emerges from the first investigation. The decision does not mean every question has been answered, and it does not establish that any particular suspect is innocent or guilty. It means the available case cannot responsibly proceed in its present form. For the families, detectives, and city, this is not an ending, only a lowering of official voices as the files begin their long movement toward shelves, drawers, and storage. The newspapers do not become quiet at once. Some blame prosecutors, some accuse wealthy interests of interference, and others continue developing theories from disputed testimony. Officials answer criticism by pointing toward damaged evidence, inconsistent witnesses, and the disorder of the first days. You can hear both defensiveness and exhaustion in their words. Beneath it all rests the simplest fact of patient investigation. Lost opportunities cannot be recreated merely because the public demands certainty. Winter arrives over New Brunswick, whitening roofs and hardening the ground around the Phillips farm. The crabapple tree becomes bare, its branches dark against a pale sky, while fewer visitors make the journey down the cold lane. In an office, the Hall Mills folders remain thick with statements that never quite settle into one account. You place them gently together, tie the bundle, and feel the rough cord press into the swollen edges of the file. But the file will not remain undisturbed forever, because people who believe a question was left unfinished rarely forget where the box was placed. For a while, though, the Hall Mills case enters a quieter season, measured by dust, changing officials, and the slow fading of public certainty. Witnesses return to farms, households, shops, and church duties, carrying whatever they truly saw or merely came to believe. And you remain beside the small lamp, listening as the courthouse settles around another unanswered night. For the detectives who first handled the inquiry, the quiet after the grand jury brings little relief. Their notebooks still contain names without firm places, automobiles without certain owners, and times remembered differently by almost everyone. You can imagine one investigator opening a desk drawer on a cold morning, seeing the Hall Mills file beneath newer work, and hesitating before closing it again. A case may leave public attention, but it doesn't always leave the mind. The first winter passes, and the city resumes the habits interrupted by the crowds. Snow settles along the streets of New Brunswick, church doors open for ordinary services, and the Phillips farm lies pale beneath the bare crabapple tree. People still discuss the case in kitchens and shops, although their voices have softened. As you walk through those imagined rooms, you notice how mystery gradually becomes local memory, told with confidence even while its underlying details remain uncertain. At St. John the Evangelist, the practical work of parish life continues without Edward Hall or Eleanor Mills. Hymnals must be placed, correspondence answered, and music chosen for each Sunday, while grief and embarrassment remain beneath these ordinary tasks. James Mills continues caring for his children and living with the knowledge that Eleanor's private letters have been printed for strangers. You sit for a moment in the empty choir stalls, where dust rests on polished wood and every faint sound seems to linger. Frances Hall also returns to a life altered by suspicion, though her material surroundings remain secure. Reporters have studied her clothing, expression, posture, and silences, often treating composure as a performance intended for them. She has not been charged, yet public curiosity behaves as though a formal judgment has already occurred. When you review the clippings, the newsprint leaves a grey trace on your fingertips, and you sense how easily a repeated description becomes a permanent label. Jane Gibson remains near de Russey's Lane, where fields and animals provide their own demanding routine. Her account has become part of the official record, but the failure to obtain indictments leaves its value unresolved. Some people believe she was ignored because her story implicated a prominent family. Others believe her changing statements made reliance impossible, and we must keep both views before us while remembering that Jane herself continued living beneath the pressure of attention. The original evidence begins a less visible life. Letters, photographs, reports, and transcripts are stored wherever officials have space, sometimes under conditions that later archivists would find troubling. Paper absorbs dampness, metal fasteners rust, and carbon copies become brittle along their folded edges. You can almost smell the courthouse basement, with its cold plaster and old paste, as the Hall Mills case settles among records that no one expects to need very soon. Yet cold cases are rarely entirely still. A former investigator may speak to a reporter, or a clerk may notice an inconsistency while searching for another document. Families preserve rumors, attorneys retain private memoranda, and witnesses reconsider what they said when the event was fresh. Each small movement disturbs the dust without necessarily changing the official result. As we remain beside the file, the useful posture is neither hope nor resignation, but continued attention. During the years that follow, American newspapers change rapidly. Compact tabloids compete for readers with large photographs, forceful headlines, and stories built around recognizable personalities. The Hall Mills case suits this new form almost perfectly, because its unresolved shape allows every editor to promise what the earlier investigation could not provide. You hear presses turning through the night, their mechanical rhythm steady and warm, while wet ink gathers on thousands of fresh pages. New York papers revisit the case whenever a witness speaks, an official changes office, or an anniversary offers a reason to return. Each retelling simplifies certain facts and enlarges others, until readers encounter a story more orderly than the investigation itself. Edward becomes the clergyman with a secret, Eleanor the choir singer who wrote tender letters, and Frances the wealthy widow whose restraint invites interpretation. We note how human lives are reduced to roles when newspapers need immediate clarity. For patient detectives, that simplification presents a serious problem. A revived inquiry must separate original memory from memory shaped by 4 years of headlines, conversations, and private rehearsal. Witnesses may honestly recall an image that entered their minds later through repetition. You turn from a 1926 statement to one recorded in 1922, comparing not only the facts, but the vocabulary, and certain phrases seem to have traveled from printed columns into spoken recollection. The political landscape also changes. New officials inherit old criticism, and they may see value in demonstrating that no family stands beyond examination. By 1926, New Jersey has a governor named A. Harry Moore, whose administration cannot easily ignore renewed public claims about neglected evidence. The Hall Mills case begins moving from memory toward official business again. Somewhere, a telephone rings in a state office, and an old box is requested from a shelf. The New York Daily Mirror plays a central role in this return. It is still establishing its place within a fierce circulation contest, and its editors understand that an unresolved national mystery can draw readers day after day. Reporters are assigned to revisit witnesses, examine contradictions, and search for neglected details. You may feel uneasy about their commercial purpose, yet some of their work does uncover questions that authorities must address with renewed care. The Mirror's editor, Philip Payne, approaches the story with the energy of a newspaperman who believes persistence can produce both truth and circulation. His staff gathers old clippings and searches out people whose names have faded from public memory. Conversations take place in parlors, farmyards, hotel rooms, and newspaper offices bright with electric lamps. As we watch from the quiet side of the desk, the distinction between reporting and investigation becomes increasingly blurred. Reporters revisit Jane Gibson, whose testimony remains the most direct claim of having witnessed events near the crabapple tree. By now, her health is poor, and the years have not made her account simpler. She continues identifying figures she says were present, while questions remain about variations in her earlier statements. You listen to her voice as it survives through transcripts, aware that the woman speaking is both a witness and a person being pulled once more into a demanding story. Other claims surface as well. There are allegations that evidence was suppressed, that witnesses received money, and that influence prevented a thorough prosecution in 1922. Some accusations come from people with motives of their own, while others contain enough detail to require examination. A patient investigator cannot dismiss a claim merely because a newspaper discovered it, but neither can publication make it true. We underline each assertion lightly, leaving room for verification. The Mirror publishes its renewed allegations in the summer of 1926, placing the Hall Mills case before readers with the force of a fresh event. Headlines present old uncertainty as newly penetrated, though much of the evidence remains circumstantial or disputed. Copies spread through railway stations and city streets, their pages snapping in warm air. You hold one at the edge of our lamplight and notice how large type can make a fragile statement appear remarkably solid. Governor Moore responds by directing that the case receive another official inquiry. The task falls into new hands, including Special Prosecutor Alexander Simpson, a state senator and experienced lawyer known for an assertive courtroom manner. Simpson inherits not a clean scene, but 4 years of conflicting testimony and incomplete records. As he opens the old files, he must work through what remains, while also determining what has quietly gone missing. The passage of time has affected nearly every category of evidence. Witnesses have moved, memories have changed, and physical objects have been handled or misplaced. Some original reports cannot be found when requested, while other papers appear in unexpected possession. You can feel the frustration of asking a clerk for a document known to have existed, then hearing drawers open and close without result. The absence of records becomes another unresolved part of the record. Simpson and his investigators begin conducting hearings and interviews, often under intense press observation. Witnesses enter official rooms where stenographers take down their words, keys tapping in an even rhythm that carries through closed doors. Outside, reporters wait with pencils ready and watch for expressions they can describe. We remain near the stenographer because the exact phrasing matters more than the face a witness makes while leaving the building. Francis Hall is questioned again, along with Willie Stevens, Henry Stevens, and Henry Carpenter. Their accounts are compared with testimony collected 4 years earlier, while prosecutors search for differences that might reveal concealment. Defense attorneys also begin protecting their clients' interests, objecting to assumptions, and preparing for possible charges. You can hear legal papers sliding across polished tables, their edges crisp, as the reopened Hall Mills inquiry becomes less historical and more immediate. The renewed investigation concentrates on Eleanor Mills's death because prosecutors believe the available evidence may be presented most effectively through that charge. This legal focus does not diminish Edward Hall's importance, though it shapes the indictment and trial strategy that follow. The distinction can seem strange to someone reading the case as one event. Yet at the courthouse, every count must satisfy particular rules, and prosecutors arrange their work according to what they believe a jury can consider. Jane Gibson's story is taken once more in detail. She describes following a suspected thief after her dog barked, riding Jenny through the dark, and approaching the area near the crabapple tree. She speaks of figures beside automobiles and of recognizing people connected with Francis Hall. You turn each page slowly, comparing the later precision with the earlier uncertainty, while outside the imagined window corn leaves move with a dry and steady whisper. Her identification of Henry Stevens raises the continuing difficulty of his Shaw alibi. Lavalette lies far enough away that the journey must be examined through roads, vehicles, and available time, not merely through suspicion. People who saw him there are questioned again, and their recollections are tested after 4 intervening years. We trace the route beneath a ruler, hearing distant surf in the mind, and recognize how geography can become a quiet but powerful witness. Henry's reputation as a marksman is repeatedly emphasized by the prosecution and the press. Skill with a firearm may explain ability, but it cannot establish presence, intention, or action on a particular night. The patient detective writes those categories separately. As you sit with this section of the file, you see how an interesting personal trait can draw attention beyond its proper evidentiary weight, especially when a public story has already selected its preferred shape. Willie Stevens receives a different kind of scrutiny. He is dependent upon his sister, possesses unusual habits, and is described in the language of the period with little kindness. Some observers assume that eccentricity makes him suggestible or suspicious, while others regard him as harmless. We avoid treating difference as evidence. Instead, you listen for what Willie says about his movements, his household, and the objects investigators connect to the scene. Among those objects is one of Edward Hall's calling cards, reportedly found near the bodies and later examined for fingerprints. Fingerprint identification is already respected in 1926, though collection methods and preservation standards are not what you would expect today. The card has passed through uncertain handling, and its history must be established before any mark can carry much meaning. You angle the imagined card beneath soft light, seeing paper fibers and a faint smudge. Joseph Farrow, a well-known fingerprint specialist, becomes associated with the prosecution's analysis. He identifies a print on the card as belonging to Willie Stevens, a conclusion that sounds persuasive when stated without context. Yet the defense will challenge both the identification and the path by which the card traveled after discovery. We place the technical claim beside the chain of custody, because even accurate science depends upon knowing where an object has been and who has touched it. A calling card connected to Edward might naturally have been handled before the night at the Phillips farm. Willie lived in the same household and may have encountered personal objects belonging to his brother-in-law under innocent circumstances. If the print was genuine, its age could not be determined from the paper alone. You see how one piece of evidence can be both real and inconclusive, offering contact without explaining when, where, or why. The prosecution also examines the love letters, looking again for motive and knowledge. Some correspondence suggests that Edward and Eleanor felt watched or constrained, while other passages express affection without reference to immediate danger. Printed excerpts have already circulated widely, stripping the letters of sequence and privacy. As we restore them to chronological order, their tone becomes more human and less theatrical, though they still cannot name the person who came to the tree that night. By late summer, the investigation has gathered enough momentum for arrests. Francis Hall and Willie Stevens are taken into custody first, while proceedings continue regarding Henry Stevens and Henry Carpenter. The public watches every movement, from the arrival of automobiles to the opening of courthouse doors. You stand apart from the crowd in imagination, feeling heat rise from the pavement and hearing cameras click like small pieces of hard rain. An arrest is not proof, although newspapers often compress that distinction. For Frances and her relatives, the reopened case brings the uncertainty of formal accusation after 4 years without charges. For James Mills and his children, it renews public examination of Eleanor's private life. No one at the center of the story can remain untouched. We hold that human cost in mind, while the legal machinery moves forward with a deep, deliberate sound. On the 15th of September, 1926, almost exactly 4 years after the original discovery, a Somerset County grand jury returns indictments against Francis Hall, Willie Stevens, Henry Stevens, and Henry Carpenter. They are accused in connection with the deaths beneath the crabapple tree. The timing gives newspapers an easy anniversary frame, though the jurors have considered testimony rather than symbolism. You read the indictment's formal language, noticing how legal sentences turn years of confusion into a few controlled paragraphs. The case against Henry Carpenter is separated from the joint trial of Frances and her 2 brothers. This procedural choice narrows the coming courtroom, though his name remains within the prosecution's theory. Defense teams prepare challenges to the witness identifications, forensic claims, and allegations of improper influence. Simpson prepares to assemble the scattered evidence into a single account. Between them lies a jury not yet chosen, and beyond them waits an enormous audience. Somerville becomes the center of activity as the trial approaches. The Somerset County Courthouse, built for ordinary local matters, must accommodate lawyers, witnesses, reporters, technicians, and spectators arriving from across the country. Telephone lines are expanded, workspaces improvised, and equipment brought in to transmit stories rapidly. You can smell damp wool coats and overheated wires in the corridors, while footsteps echo from stone walls, polished by decades of use. Hotels and boarding houses fill with correspondence. Newspapers establish temporary offices where typewriters continue late into the night, and messengers carry copy through streets growing cold with autumn. The Hall Mills case is no longer merely a New Jersey inquiry. It has become national theater despite the court's attempt to maintain legal order. We hear the machinery around the trial, but we keep our attention on the quieter machinery within it. Questions, objections, exhibits, and memory. Jury selection begins under the gaze of a public that has already read thousands of words about the defendants. Prospective jurors are asked what they know, what opinions they hold, and whether those opinions can be set aside. Complete unfamiliarity is difficult to find after 4 years of publicity. You sit behind the attorneys as each person answers, hearing chairs creak against the courtroom floor and wondering how anyone empties the mind of a story repeated so often. The trial formally opens on the 3rd of November, 1926. Judges Charles Parker and Frank Cleary preside, while Alexander Simpson leads the prosecution and an experienced group of attorneys represents the defendants. Francis Hall sits with Willie and Henry, each observed by rows of reporters who treat the slightest gesture as material. You unfold the day's transcript under our small lamp, and the courtroom emerges through the dry, precise language of the clerk. Simpson presents the state's theory as a planned confrontation driven by knowledge of the relationship between Edward and Eleanor. He proposes that Frances and members of her family traveled to the Phillips farm and were present when the deaths occurred. The theory gives the scattered evidence a definite form, but the defense reminds jurors that form is not the same as foundation. We listen to both openings without leaning forward, allowing each claim to wait for its promised support. The prosecution must reach backward across 4 years. It calls people who discovered the scene, officials who examined it, witnesses who saw movements around New Brunswick, and experts who studied physical objects. Each witness adds a small section, though the sections do not always meet cleanly. You watch attorneys turn pages at the lectern, searching for earlier wording while afternoon light shifts slowly across the high courtroom windows. Raymond Schneider recounts the Saturday morning walk that led him and Pearl Balmer toward the crabapple tree. By trial time, even his role has been complicated by publicity, private conduct, and questions about statements made during the first investigation. The defense examines his credibility carefully. We return to the simple portion that remains firm. 2 young people entered the field, saw the quiet figures beneath the branches, and carried word toward the authorities. Officials describe the condition of the Phillips farm and the objects gathered there. Their testimony also exposes how poorly the location was protected, giving the defense repeated opportunities to question contamination and loss. Jurors hear about crowds, moved objects, and uncertain custody. You can sense the case weakening. Whenever an exhibit arrives without a clear history, its paper envelope worn smooth by hands that were never fully recorded. Medical witnesses speak about the timing and cause of death, but their conclusions cannot identify the people responsible. We needn't remain with the physical injuries, and the courtroom record itself offers more than enough without detailed repetition. What matters for the investigation is that the deaths occurred deliberately and likely on Thursday night. You turn beyond the clinical pages, leaving them closed while the testimony returns to roads, clocks, voices, and cars. The letters are introduced, bringing Edward and Eleanor's private expressions into the courtroom once again. Portions are read aloud while spectators listen to words never intended for them. The prosecution uses the correspondence to establish the relationship and suggest a motive for confrontation. Yet as you hear the sentences in sequence, you may also feel the sadness of 2 absent people becoming evidence through their most vulnerable language. Francis remains composed during these readings, and reporters describe that composure in detail. Some call it coldness, while supporters regard it as discipline under humiliation. The court cannot measure grief by expression, though public storytelling repeatedly tries. We observe without deciding what her stillness means. Beneath the lamps, her dark clothing absorbs the light, and the scratch of hundreds of pencils becomes the room's most persistent sound. Witnesses from New Brunswick testify about the movements of Edward and Eleanor on the 14th of September. One remembers a figure near a street, another a vehicle, and another a conversation whose exact time remains uncertain. Defense lawyers compare their testimony with statements from 1922, drawing attention to changed wording. You follow with 2 documents placed side by side, noticing how 4 years can add confidence while subtracting dependable detail. The prosecution introduces testimony suggesting that Frances knew of the relationship earlier than she admitted. Servants, church associates, and acquaintances are asked about letters, telephone calls, and household conversations. Knowledge could provide emotional context, but it still cannot establish presence at the farm. We write that distinction again in the margin. The pencil has grown blunt now, and a small crescent of graphite dust rests beside the word knowledge. A servant's memory can be especially difficult to interpret in a prominent household. Employees observe routines closely, yet their position may make them cautious when speaking about employers. Later attention can also reward claims that once seemed too uncertain to mention. You listen for the plain domestic details beneath the questioning: a tray carried upstairs, a door closing, an automobile heard outside, and a telephone bell sounding through a quiet hallway. The defense stresses that investigators searched the hall home and questioned its occupants without finding physical evidence that securely placed them at de Russey's lane. It presents the original failure to indict as evidence of weakness rather than influence. Prosecutors answer that the first investigation was incomplete and compromised. As we follow the exchange, the same damaged inquiry serves both sides, one calling it concealment, and the other calling it reasonable doubt. Questions about missing documents enter the proceedings and deepen the administrative confusion. Papers known to have existed in 1922 are difficult to locate, and accusations arise regarding their removal or attempted sale. The courtroom briefly becomes an inquiry into the inquiry itself. You can hear cupboards opening across several offices as clerks search for reports that should have remained together, each empty folder producing another quiet measure of frustration. This loss matters because an earlier statement is often the best means of testing a later one. Without the original wording, attorneys must rely on recollection, summaries or copies whose completeness may be questioned. A missing page does not prove a conspiracy, but neither is it harmless. We leave a blank sheet in its place, and the blankness becomes strangely eloquent, showing exactly where confidence cannot safely stand. The fingerprint evidence brings a different atmosphere into the courtroom. Joseph Farrow explains patterns, ridges, and points of comparison, using enlarged impressions to guide jurors through a field unfamiliar to many of them. His presentation offers the calm authority of technical method. You lean closer to the exhibit, seeing loops and branching lines magnified beyond their ordinary size, like narrow roads crossing a pale and silent landscape. Farrow identifies the mark on Edward's calling card with Willie Stevens. The prosecution treats this as a physical link between a defendant and an object found at the scene. Defense attorneys respond by challenging how the card was collected, stored, photographed, and handled. They also emphasize that Willie had ordinary opportunities to touch belongings connected with Edward before the deaths. The science may identify a finger, but it cannot by itself identify the moment of contact. Experts called by the defense dispute aspects of Farrow's conclusion or its significance. Jurors must compare enlarged images, while lawyers point to tiny formations that seem clear only after explanation. You can imagine the paperboards shifting on their easels and spectators stretching for a better view. For a half-asleep listener beside our lamp, the deeper lesson is gentle and enduring. Precision in one part of an analysis cannot repair uncertainty surrounding the whole. Willie's personality becomes almost an exhibit of its own, despite the defense's effort to keep attention on evidence. Reporters describe his expressions, movements, interests, and manner of answering questions. The language used about him reflects the limited understanding and casual cruelty of the era. We choose a quieter view. You see a middle-aged man under extraordinary scrutiny, trying to explain ordinary habits while strangers convert every unusual detail into meaning. The prosecution seeks to show that Willie's loyalty to Francis could have drawn him into a confrontation. Loyalty, however, is common within families and takes many forms. Without reliable proof of his presence at the farm, it remains an inference built upon relationship. You turn the page and listen as witnesses place him in or near the Hall household, not beneath the crabapple tree, leaving the crucial distance between those places still unbridged. Henry Stevens's alibi receives extended attention. Witnesses from La Valette describe seeing him at the shore on the relevant evening, while prosecutors question their times and opportunities for observation. The defense lays out the physical difficulty of traveling to New Brunswick and returning unnoticed. We follow the route again, now with road maps and testimony, hearing waves against the distant beach, while automobiles labor over 1922 roads. A telephone call associated with Henry's presence at La Valette becomes one of the small anchors of his account. The timing, identity of the speaker, and surrounding witnesses are examined closely. Such details lack the emotional force of secret letters, but they often matter more. You can almost feel the receiver's black weight in someone's hand, the cord twisting slightly, while a voice carried across wires places an ordinary person in a particular room. Prosecutors suggest that alibi witnesses may be mistaken or protective. Defense attorneys answer that the state cannot replace a supported distant location with a witness whose identifications changed. The jurors must decide which uncertainty is greater. We do not hurry them. Instead, you sit with the map and the transcript until both become familiar, letting distance remain distance unless dependable evidence finds a way across it. Then Jane Gibson's turn approaches, and the courtroom's already considerable attention gathers around her. Her health has declined seriously, raising doubts about whether she can appear at all. The prosecution regards her as essential because she alone claims direct recognition of the accused near the tree. Outside the courthouse, reporters prepare for a spectacle, but inside our quiet telling, we remember that an ill woman is being asked to carry years of public expectation in her voice. Jane is brought to the courthouse by ambulance and taken into the courtroom on a hospital bed. Medical attendants remain nearby as the bed is positioned where the jury can see and hear her. The scene is extraordinary, yet we needn't sharpen it into drama. You notice the white linen, the iron frame, the medicinal smell beneath crowded air, and the exhausted stillness of someone whose body has little strength left to spare. From that bed, Jane tells the story of the barking dog, the suspected thief, and her ride through the fields on Jenny. She describes automobiles near de Russey's lane and figures gathered around the crabapple tree. She says she heard a woman's voice and the name Henry, then identifies people she associates with the Hall family. The courtroom listens closely while the stenographer's hands continue their steady, disciplined motion. Her account gives the prosecution what its other evidence cannot: claimed eyewitness presence. Yet every identification arrives burdened by earlier versions, delayed disclosures, newspaper contact, and questions about visibility in the September darkness. You imagine standing where Jane said she stood, looking through distance, branches, and uncertain light. Recognition may have been possible, but possibility is not certainty, and the file offers no instrument capable of measuring what her eyes truly resolved. Defense counsel begins the slow work of comparison. Jane is asked about differences between her first statements and later ones, including the number of people, their positions, the vehicles, and what she heard. She answers some questions firmly and others less clearly, while illness makes the examination harder for everyone. We turn between transcripts, not to embarrass her, but to see whether the central account remains stable enough to bear the prosecution's weight. At moments, the courtroom loses its quiet discipline. Jane's elderly mother is present and openly disputes her daughter's truthfulness, adding a painful family conflict to an already difficult proceeding. Newspapers seize upon the interruption as unforgettable theatre. We treat it more gently. You can hear confusion moving through the room, but you also sense two women with a long private history being reduced before strangers to opposing parts of a public scene. The judges restore order, and the questioning continues. Jane's physical weakness does not automatically make her mistaken, just as her determination does not establish accuracy. The jury must evaluate her in the same careful way it evaluates every witness, while acknowledging the unusual conditions of her appearance. You rest your hand beside the transcript and notice that its clean typed lines cannot preserve pauses, fatigue, or the changing pressure of the room. Other witnesses are called to support portions of Jane's account. Some place her outside that evening, while others recall automobiles or people near roads connected to the farm. Yet corroboration often reaches only the edges of her story, not the central identifications. A person may confirm that Jane rode her mule without confirming what she saw afterward. We draw a fine line between those propositions, because cases can become distorted when support for one detail is allowed to spread across all. The defense brings witnesses who contradict Jane or question her reliability. Earlier statements are read, acquaintances describe prior conversations, and inconsistencies accumulate before the jury. None of this proves that she saw nothing. It does, however, make her claimed certainty difficult to separate from the years of attention surrounding her. You look toward the high windows where November daylight has turned thin and grey, and allow the uncertainty to remain visible. As the trial continues, the courtroom acquires a daily rhythm. Attorneys arrive with fresh bundles, spectators queue before dawn, and reporters secure familiar places at their tables. Lunch is taken quickly, telephone operators relay copy, and evening editions appear before testimony has fully settled. You can hear paper rustling through every pause. The Hall Mills case is being judged in one room and consumed in thousands of others at the same time. The scale of coverage affects nearly everyone. Witnesses know that their words will travel beyond Somerville. Attorneys shape phrases for both jurors and headlines, and spectators react to moments already framed by the press. The judges repeatedly insist that legal decisions belong to evidence admitted in court. We sit with the jury in imagination, trying to hear the testimony beneath the great outer hum of national curiosity. Frances Hall eventually takes the stand in her own defense, exposing herself to direct questioning about her marriage, knowledge, and movements. She speaks in a controlled manner and denies participating in any journey to the Phillips farm that night. Her answers are studied for hesitation, though hesitation can arise from memory, caution, or the pressure of the room. You listen to the words rather than the commentary surrounding them, letting each response rest on its own terms. She acknowledges aspects of her life with Edward, while resisting the prosecution's interpretation of motive. The private strain of a marriage cannot be easily translated into public language, especially before a crowded courtroom. Prosecutors ask what she knew about Eleanor, when she knew it, and how she reacted. As we follow the questions, we remember that emotional knowledge may explain silence or confrontation, but it cannot alone place an automobile onto Russey's lane. Frances describes the hours when Edward failed to return and the inquiries made the following morning. The state presses her about inconsistencies and about contacts with members of her family. Defense counsel offers alternative explanations grounded in confusion and concern. You place her testimony beside the earliest accounts, hearing the faint rustle of onion skin copies, and discover differences that are suggestive to some readers yet insufficiently sharp to settle the question. Willie also speaks before the jury. His answers move between direct recollection and the personal habits that reporters find irresistible, while his attorneys attempt to keep the examination grounded. He denies being present at the farm and explains his movements within the household. We listen without treating his unusual manner as a hidden message, because truth and falsehood do not adopt one dependable style of speech. Henry's defense continues to rest heavily upon distance and corroboration. His witnesses repeat their memories of Lavalette, while the prosecution challenges the possibility of coordinated protection. The shore setting enters the courtroom through plain descriptions of homes, calls, and evening company. You can almost smell salt in the cooler air as those witnesses speak, an atmosphere far removed from damp grass beneath a Somerset County tree. Day after day, the state's theory is tested against the missing physical link. No recovered weapon securely points to the defendants, no uncontested trace establishes their presence, and no witness besides Jane claims the necessary direct recognition. Circumstances surround the family, but circumstances require dependable connections. You return to the evidence table after the courtroom empties, where labeled envelopes lie beneath guarded light and seem much quieter than the arguments built around them. The defense emphasizes alternative possibilities without needing to prove any single one. Other people knew of the relationship, the meeting place was accessible, and the early scene was too disturbed to exclude unknown participants. A defendant does not have to solve the case in order to show doubt. We let that legal principle settle gently over the file, like a clean sheet placed between fragile pages, to prevent further damage. Alexander Simpson nevertheless works to bind motive, witness testimony, fingerprints, and disputed movements into a coherent prosecution. His closing approach draws upon Frances's knowledge, her brother's loyalty, and Jane's identification. He asks jurors to view weaknesses individually, but strength collectively. You hear the practiced rise and fall of courtroom speech, though we keep our own pace even, attending to the evidence rather than the advocate's cadence. Defense attorneys answer by returning to the failures of 1922. They remind jurors that the farm was overrun, exhibits mishandled, records lost, and witnesses exposed to endless publicity. They challenge Jane's changing story and the limited meaning of the fingerprint. Their argument asks the jury to see not a complete chain, but separate links laid near one another beneath persuasive light. Closing speeches continue across long hours, and the room grows warm despite the November weather. Jurors listen from their box while spectators shift carefully on hard benches. Outside, evening settles over Somerville, where restaurant windows glow and telephone lines carry partial reports toward distant cities. You remain with the jurors as they receive the judge's instructions, each legal phrase measured against the solemn responsibility awaiting them. The judges explain that suspicion, however strong, cannot replace proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They describe how testimony should be weighed and how the charges apply separately to each defendant. The instructions are less colorful than the newspaper narratives, but their plainness matters. You hear the clerk's voice, the occasional cough, and the soft movement of papers as the long public performance finally narrows to a private decision. Before the jurors leave the courtroom, they look once more toward the defendants, the attorneys, and the exhibits that have occupied nearly a month. Frances sits beside Willie and Henry, all three waiting without knowing how the accumulated uncertainty will be resolved. Jane Gibson's hospital bed is gone. though her testimony remains at the center of the case. We close the transcript for a moment, while the jury room door swings inward on quiet hinges. The jury room is smaller than the courtroom, with plain walls, a long table, and windows looking into the December afternoon. 12 men begin reviewing nearly a month of testimony, though no one can carry every spoken word into that room with equal clarity. They have exhibits, recollections, and the judge's instructions, along with the ordinary human impressions that instructions cannot entirely remove. You sit with them only in imagination, hearing chairs settle and paper slide across the worn wooden table. Their first task is not to decide who might have had a motive, but whether the state proved its specific charge against each defendant. Jane Gibson's testimony must be weighed against her earlier accounts, and the fingerprint must be considered beside its uncertain history. Henry's alibi and Willie's explanations return to the discussion. Francis's knowledge of the relationship remains important, though the jurors must decide whether knowledge reaches far enough to establish her presence beneath the tree. Outside, the courthouse remains crowded. Reporters wait near telephones, while editors in distant rooms reserve space for whichever verdict arrives. Spectators gather along the streets of Somerville, despite the winter chill, their breath briefly visible beneath street lamps. You can hear the low conversation through the courthouse walls, yet inside the jury room the work continues at a quieter pace, one disputed point after another, with no headline large enough to complete the missing evidence. The jurors deliberate for several hours. They request or reconsider portions of the case, then return to the central standard given by the judges. Suspicion may surround the Hall family, but the state's direct witness has proved uncertain, and the physical evidence does not securely place the defendants at de Russey's lane. As the afternoon moves toward evening, the room's light changes, and a decision begins to settle through the slow process of collective agreement. On the 3rd of December, 1926, the jurors return to the courtroom. Everyone rises or turns toward them, and the room that has held weeks of argument becomes attentive to a few short words. Francis Hall, Willie Stevens, and Henry Stevens are found not guilty. You can imagine the verdict moving through the benches like a change in air pressure, followed almost immediately by pencils, footsteps, and the quick opening of the doors. For the defendants, acquittal ends the immediate danger of conviction. It does not erase the public story attached to their names, and it does not identify another person responsible for the deaths. The verdict speaks only to the prosecution's failure to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. We keep that legal meaning clear as newspapers rush toward broader interpretations, some calling the outcome justice and others describing it as another failure of influence. Francis receives the decision with the same restraint reporters have studied throughout the trial. Willie and Henry also leave the courtroom cleared of the charge, though not freed from years of speculation. Their attorneys emphasize the weaknesses exposed during testimony. Alexander Simpson has pursued the case with force, but the result confirms how difficult it was to build reliable proof from a damaged scene, changing memories, and records already 4 years old. The pending case against Henry Carpenter loses its practical foundation after the joint acquittal. Prosecutors no longer possess a persuasive reason to conduct another trial, built upon much of the same disputed evidence. His charge is eventually abandoned, leaving no additional courtroom in which the state's theory can be tested. You place his file beside the others, noticing that an untried accusation leaves a different kind of uncertainty, neither conviction nor full examination before a jury. The courthouse empties slowly that evening. Portable equipment is packed, typewriters are covered, and reporters begin leaving the rooms they occupied for a month. Scraps of paper remain beneath tables, while tobacco smoke thins near the high ceiling. Somerville has hosted one of the most watched trials of its era. Yet after the final trains depart, the stone building resumes its ordinary silence. You stand in the corridor and hear a custodian's broom move over the floor. But there is one more detail before the trial can recede into history, because the verdict itself becomes part of the Hall Mills investigation. Detectives and lawyers now know which evidence a jury found insufficient, even if jurors do not explain every part of their reasoning. Jane's account could not overcome its inconsistencies. The fingerprint lacked dependable context, and the alibis retained force. The unsuccessful prosecution becomes a map of evidentiary weakness, marked in careful and sometimes painful lines. A later investigator, reopening the case, would need to begin with that map. Repeating the same theory with the same witnesses would not create stronger proof merely through persistence. Each weak point would require new support, independent of newspaper stories and family reputation. You turn back through the transcript, placing small slips beside moments where the prosecution relied upon implication, and the number of markers gradually exceeds the places where evidence stands securely alone. The first marker belongs to the Phillips farm. By the time officials established control, too many people had crossed the ground, handled papers, and altered the surroundings. No later questioning could restore the earliest footprints or determine which objects had been removed. In modern language, the scene lacked a trustworthy chain of custody. For investigators in 1922, it remained a practical lesson, learned in public and remembered with lasting regret. Another marker belongs to jurisdiction. Middlesex officials knew the missing people and their households, while Somerset authorities held responsibility for the location where they were found. Cooperation existed, but it was uneven and complicated by personalities, procedure, and public blame. You lay the two county maps side by side, their boundary running close to the tree, and understand how information divided by office can become incomplete, even when every individual believes he is doing his duty. A third marker belongs to the witness statements. The earliest words were not always recorded fully, and later versions developed after witnesses had encountered widespread coverage. Some statements survived only through summaries or recollections. You can hear the soft, irregular tapping of an early typewriter as a clerk condenses an interview, perhaps omitting hesitation or uncertainty. Years later, that shortened page may be treated as exact, although its apparent neatness conceals the conversation. The trial also shows how a theory can organize evidence too strongly. Once officials concentrate upon Frances and her relatives, every letter, family conversation, automobile, and unusual gesture begins leaning toward that conclusion. Alternative suspects and explanations receive less sustained attention. A careful cold case investigator would call this a risk of confirmation, though the older detectives use different words. You notice it whenever a question assumes the answer it is meant to discover. At the same time, the acquittal does not establish that the prosecution's theory was impossible. It establishes that the evidence presented could not meet the legal standard. Frances may have known more than she said, or she may simply have guarded a painful private life from strangers. Jane may have seen figures she later identified incorrectly, or she may have been more accurate than the jury believed. The file permits several possibilities while proving none of them with confidence. This is the peculiar stillness that follows an unresolved trial. Before court, investigators can hope that witnesses and exhibits will produce clarity under examination. After acquittal, those same materials have been tested and found unable to carry the charge. You close the transcript and feel its considerable weight, knowing that thousands of pages can leave a reader with fewer certainties than a single reliable photograph or uncontested trace. The newspapers continue their work after the verdict. Editorials assign blame. Columnists revisit favorite theories, and magazines recount the trial for readers who followed it from distant states. The Mirror can claim that its campaign forced official action, though it cannot claim a conviction. Rival papers question the prosecution and one another. You hear the presses again, but their rhythm now feels less expectant, as if the machinery itself knows the story has resisted a tidy ending. Public attention gradually moves elsewhere. New scandals, elections, trials, and disasters occupy the large type that once belonged to Hall Mills. Yet occasional articles return to the crabapple tree, especially when a participant dies or an anniversary arrives. Each return repeats a simplified outline, and small errors begin reproducing across decades. The patient reader must move backward toward original records, where uncertainty is less convenient, but far more honest. For James Mills, the verdict brings no formal answer concerning Eleanor. He has lived through the exposure of her correspondence, the examination of his marriage, and the public assumption that his reactions can reveal guilt or innocence in others. His children have watched their mother become a character in a national story. We imagine their home after the papers stop calling, where ordinary evening sounds resume, but one chair remains permanently empty. Charlotte Mills, old enough to understand much of what happened, carries both grief and unwanted public identity. Daniel is younger, though he also grows beneath a surname attached to headlines. The children cannot place their mother's memory outside the case, because strangers have already joined the two. You turn away from the courtroom and sit quietly with this domestic consequence, hearing dishes being put away and a household continuing through sheer routine. Frances returns to her own household under different circumstances, but with another kind of permanent attention. Although acquitted, she remains the person most often named whenever the case is retold. Social position protects privacy in some ways and destroys it in others, because her name makes the story more attractive to publishers. You walk past the Hall residence in imagination, its windows curtained against the evening, and resist the temptation to treat silence as a confession. Willie also continues living under the shadow of the trial. His eccentricities have been described nationally, often without compassion, and his acquittal cannot recall those descriptions. People encountering him may already believe they know something essential from a newspaper sketch. As we keep company with the file, we make room for the simpler truth that a person can be unusual, dependent, or socially awkward without those qualities becoming evidence of a hidden act. Henry returns to a life in which the Lavalette alibi remains both his protection and a subject of lingering suspicion. People who favor the prosecution's theory imagine ways he might have traveled despite the testimony, while others regard the sure witnesses as decisive. No recovered record closes the distance completely. You trace the road once more, not because repetition will solve it, but because patient work respects geography, even when imagination prefers a shorter route. Jane Gibson survives the trial by only a few years. Her health continues failing, and she dies without her account ever receiving a final confirmation or disproof. The newspaper nickname follows her, even in later notices, reducing a complicated witness to the animals she raised. We use her name instead. You can picture the fields near her home, growing quiet after winter sunset, while Jenny's old path disappears beneath weeds and fallen leaves. Her testimony remains one of the file's most difficult elements, Some details correspond with reports from others, while her identifications shift and expand in ways that cannot be ignored. Illness, class prejudice, press pressure, fear, and memory all surround her words. A responsible investigator can neither accept nor discard her wholesale. You place her separate statements in chronological order and allow their differences to speak with a low but persistent voice. Years later, people sometimes ask why investigators did not simply determine where every automobile was that night. In 1922, vehicle records were limited, roads carried fewer cars than today, and descriptions depended upon fleeting visual impressions. Headlights could hide faces as easily as reveal them, while body styles and colors looked different in darkness. You stand beside Russey's lane and hear an engine pass, its sound fading before you can assign it a name. There were no networks of public cameras, no electronic toll records, and no telephones quietly recording location. Detectives relied upon garage employees, fuel purchasers, neighbors, household staff, and mechanical traces in soft ground. Even those traces were compromised by later traffic. The investigation therefore became a patient search through human routine. You ask who cleaned the car, who heard it leave, and whether warm machinery carried a faint smell of oil after midnight. The available forensic tools also had narrow limits. Fingerprints could associate a person with a surface under good conditions, but they could not state when the contact occurred. Blood typing could sometimes exclude possibilities, though it could not identify one person with modern precision. Fibers, soil, and hair were collected less systematically than they would be later. You open an evidence envelope and feel how much potential depends upon what someone thought to preserve in advance. No investigator in 1922 could imagine the later power of genetic analysis. Biological material that might now be treated with extraordinary caution could then be handled, exposed, or discarded after basic examination. Even when objects survived, decades of uncertain storage could complicate modern testing. We do not assume that every old envelope contains a silent answer. Before any laboratory work, a cold case team would need to establish whether an uncontaminated sample still exists. The love letters offer another form of trace, one based on language rather than biology. Investigators and later writers search them for hints of a planned departure, a feared confrontation, or knowledge of surveillance. Yet intimate correspondence often uses exaggeration, private references, and hopes never intended as literal schedules. You read slowly, allowing one paragraph to illuminate another, and the letters sound less like clues than two people trying to create a small protected world. That protected world was already vulnerable. Church communities can observe patterns closely, especially when the same people attend rehearsals, services, meetings, and social events. A glance held too long, or an unnecessary errand, may become visible through repetition. We imagine the choir room after practice, with music folders closing and coats gathered from hooks, while someone notices who remains behind. Knowledge may have spread quietly, without anyone admitting how much they understood. A later investigator would therefore map the parish relationships in detail. Who knew Edward's habits? Who understood Eleanor's schedule? And who had access to their messages? Which person knew the Phillips farm as a meeting place? And which witness learned that only after publication? You draw circles around names from the church directory, connecting households with faint pencil lines. Soon the page resembles a web, though a web of acquaintance is not itself proof of involvement. James Mills must remain within that map, not because his modest circumstances make him suspicious, but because spouse is unnaturally examined in such inquiries. His knowledge of Eleanor's movements and his statements about the marriage deserve the same careful comparison applied to Francis. Early investigators questioned him, and newspapers often portrayed him according to their preferred theory. You return to his actual words, listening for what he knew before discovery, rather than what later accounts placed in his mouth. Raymond Schneider also remains worthy of close review. As one of the people who found the bodies, he entered the story before public contamination reached its height. His private conduct with Pearl Balmer exposed him to pressure and embarrassment, while later statements brought further scrutiny. A detective must distinguish those credibility concerns from unsupported theories about direct involvement. You examine his route, timing, and first report, keeping moral judgment separate from evidentiary value. Pearl's youth demands particular caution. At 15, questioned amid national attention and personal scandal, she occupied a vulnerable position rarely acknowledged by the era's newspapers. Her accounts were filtered through adults who did not always protect her dignity. We listen for the earliest version she gave before later interviews complicated the record. The paper may feel thin beneath your hand, but the pressure placed upon the young witness was anything but light. Other local figures move through the file briefly and then disappear. Farmers, drivers, church members, neighbors, household employees, and people walking near the roads each contribute a sight or sound. Some statements align, while others contradict events firmly established elsewhere. You begin a witness table, placing time, location, original wording, and later changes into separate columns. The work is slow, almost meditative, and more useful than selecting only the accounts that support one theory. When you sort those statements chronologically, an important pattern appears. Early recollections are generally shorter and less certain, while later ones contain names, motives, and dramatic details already familiar from coverage. This does not mean every later detail is invented. Memory sometimes returns through context, yet the pattern warns us that information flowed outward from investigators and newspapers, then back inward through witnesses who had absorbed the public story. A cold case review would also separate observations from conclusions. I saw a dark automobile belongs in one column, while I saw the hall car requires a basis for identification. I heard a voice differs from recognizing a particular speaker, especially across a field at night. You rewrite several statements in this careful form, and much of their apparent certainty dissolves. What remains may be modest, but modest evidence is easier to evaluate with fairness. There is also the question of weather and natural light, the phase of the moon, cloud cover, tree growth, and orientation of automobile headlights can help test Jane's claimed view. Those conditions should be reconstructed from contemporary records rather than guessed from later photographs. You stand at the edge of the field on an imagined September evening, letting your eyes adjust. The crabapple tree becomes a dark shape, and details beyond it arrive slowly, if they arrive at all. Sound behaves differently across open ground. Voices may carry clearly when the air is still, yet words can blur through leaves, distance, and engine noise. A name such as Henry might be heard accurately or supplied later by expectation. Investigators in 1922 could revisit the location and perform informal tests, but surviving accounts of those tests would need close scrutiny. We speak softly across the field and hear how one syllable reaches farther than an entire sentence. The arrangement beneath the tree also encouraged investigators to infer symbolic intention. The placement of the bodies and the scattered correspondence appeared too deliberate to be accidental, suggesting that someone remained after the deaths and shaped the scene. That possibility matters, though symbolism invites over-interpretation. You study the photographs only as long as necessary, focusing upon object position and distance, while refusing the lurid meanings newspapers attached to every small detail. If the scene was arranged, the responsible person may have wanted investigators to recognize the relationship immediately. Edward's card and the letters made concealment of identity or intimacy unlikely. Perhaps the arrangement expressed anger, humiliation, or a wish to direct suspicion. Yet each explanation depends upon an unknown mind. We write staging with a question mark beside it, because the difference between deliberate display and later disturbance cannot be reconstructed with complete assurance. The absence of the weapon is another enduring gap. Searches of the surrounding land, water, homes, and routes produced no item securely connected to the deaths and defendants. Without it, marks could not be compared to a known object in a way that identified ownership or recent use. You hear searchers moving through weeds, poles touching muddy water, and metal tools striking stones. Their work is patient, but patience cannot guarantee that a discarded object will be found. Investigators also examined clothing and automobiles for traces, though the delay and uncertain procedures limited the results. A car cleaned during ordinary use might lose fragile material without any intention to conceal. Clothing washed or brushed could do the same. We avoid reading guilt into cleanliness alone. You stand beside an early automobile with its upholstery smelling of leather and dust, aware that every surface could hold evidence while no one yet knows what to collect or preserve. Rumors of bribery remain particularly difficult. Several witnesses and officials are accused at various times of receiving money, withholding information, or mishandling documents for profit. Some claims reveal genuine misconduct around the case, while others arise from the assumption that only corruption can explain failure. You examine bank records, employment changes, and sworn denials where they survive, refusing to let either wealth or rumor substitute for a documented transaction. One troubling episode concerns attempts to profit from confidential material connected with the original grand jury. Papers or purported transcripts appear outside proper custody, and people associated with officials become subjects of inquiry. This behavior damages confidence even when it does not prove that the central evidence was suppressed. You can feel the institutional embarrassment in later testimony. A courthouse depends upon guarded records, and a missing packet weakens trust far beyond its physical size. The special prosecution in 1926 uses these failures to explain why the earlier case stalled. The defense uses the same failures to show that the evidence cannot be trusted. Both positions contain a measure of truth. Poor handling may hide useful proof while also creating false impressions. You place the arguments on opposite sides of the desk, then notice that they meet in one quiet conclusion. The earliest hours mattered more than anyone understood at the time. After the trial, formal investigative energy diminishes again. No new witness emerges with independent, verifiable information strong enough to support another prosecution. Officials change, and the participants age. The Hall Mills file returns to storage, now accompanied by a massive trial record and an even larger collection of clippings. You can feel the shelf bow slightly beneath the combined weight, while dust begins softening the labels on the spines. Yet private investigators, journalists, lawyers, and curious local residents continue revisiting the case. Some seek a neglected clue, while others arrive with a preferred suspect and arrange the old evidence accordingly. Books and articles propose solutions involving the Hall family, James Mills, unknown assailants, or groups acting from moral hostility. We read these theories cautiously, asking not whether they sound complete, but whether they rely upon facts independent of the author's chosen ending. One later theory points toward the Ku Klux Klan, which had a visible presence in New Jersey during the 1920s and sometimes claimed to enforce its own harsh moral standards. The relationship between a clergyman and choir member could have attracted hostility. Yet no dependable document or witness securely connects a Klan group to the Phillips farm. You turn through the relevant pages and find atmosphere, opportunity, and speculation, but no firm evidentiary bridge. Other theories focus upon unnamed church members or local acquaintances who knew of the affair. Such possibilities cannot be excluded simply because the original inquiry concentrated elsewhere. Still, the passage of time makes testing them difficult, and broad access is not the same as specific opportunity. You review membership rolls and local directories, hearing the faint crackle of old paper, while dozens of ordinary names wait without reason to be turned into suspects. A few writers return to James Mills, interpreting his behavior through jealousy or humiliation. The same caution applied to Francis must apply here. A spouse's possible motive deserves investigation, but motive without reliable presence and supporting evidence remains incomplete. You compare his timeline with early statements, then resist the urge to fill blank intervals with imagination. The open space on the page may be frustrating, yet it is more truthful than a convenient invented journey. The prosecution's original theory remains the most familiar because it reached a public trial. Familiarity gives it a certain gravity, as though repeated examination must mean underlying correctness. But a theory can become culturally permanent even after a jury finds the evidence insufficient. We separate historical prominence from factual strength. You can almost hear the old headlines insisting from their folders, while the quieter transcript answers that accusation requires more than memorable names. In time, the Phillips farm itself changes. Roads are widened, buildings appear, and the rural edge of New Brunswick becomes more developed. De Russey's Lane is absorbed into a different landscape, known in later years as part of Franklin Boulevard. The crabapple tree and open field no longer offer the same physical reference points. You walk the modern route in imagination, listening beneath traffic for a mule's steps that the altered ground can no longer return. Landscape change complicates reconstruction, but does not make it impossible. Survey maps, deeds, aerial photographs, and road plans can restore approximate boundaries. A patient researcher overlays old and new maps, aligning streams, property lines, and surviving structures. You smooth, translucent paper across the desk, and the vanished Phillips farm appears faintly beneath later streets. Place survives in records, even when its grass and trees have given way to pavement. Local memory preserves another kind of geography. Older residents recall where the lane turned, where Jane's farm stood, and how people reached the crabapple tree. Oral accounts can guide archival work, though they must be checked against maps and dates. You sit with an elderly speaker in a warm room, hearing a clock tick behind the conversation, and notice how memory holds atmosphere with greater confidence than exact distance. New Brunswick also changes around the homes and church connected with the case. Buildings acquire new uses, families move, and addresses become historical reference points. St. John the Evangelist remains central to understanding how Edward and Eleanor met, worked, and became known to one another. You step into the sanctuary again, where cooler air and varnished wood carry a faint scent of age, and the case briefly returns to the ordinary human setting from which it began. Archives eventually become the safest place for what survives. Rutgers University preserves a small collection of materials connected with the Hall Mills case, including correspondence, copied medical records, legal papers, and other documents originating from official custody. The New Brunswick Free Public Library also holds historical materials and later broadcasts. You enter the reading room with clean hands and a pencil, while a box is brought from storage on a quiet rolling cart. The box is smaller than the legend. Inside are folders with typed labels, photocopies, clippings, and papers whose edges have softened through time. An archivist explains handling rules in a low voice, and you place one folder at a time upon a support. The room smells faintly of paper, cloth bindings, and conditioned air. Here, the Hall Mills case is no longer a noisy trial, but a measured sequence of pages waiting for patient attention. You begin with the finding aid, because even mystery requires organization. Dates, document types, and original sources are listed in concise language that avoids speculation. This simple inventory tells you what the archive possesses and, just as importantly, what it does not. You mark possible connections in pencil, never ink, and allow the institutional order to slow your thinking. Every folder has boundaries, while the historical questions extend beyond them. Copies of correspondence preserve voices that newspapers often rearranged. Reading the full text allows tone and sequence to return, though you remain aware that some originals are elsewhere or no longer available. You examine typewritten transcripts beside handwritten reproductions, noting where punctuation may have changed. A comma inserted by a typist can subtly alter meaning. The detective's patience now resembles editorial care, attentive to every modest difference. Legal documents restore the formal steps obscured by sensational retellings. Pleas, motions, indictment language, and court rulings reveal what was actually alleged and what evidence judges permitted jurors to hear. You notice how much later writing confuses suspicion with charge with trial, and acquittal with exoneration of every possible fact. The legal papers are dry, but their dryness provides welcome clarity. Medical records require respectful distance. They contain information necessary to establish time and cause. Yet they also describe two people whose dignity deserves protection. We read only what the investigation requires and leave unnecessary detail unspoken. The paper itself may be a later typed copy, so provenance matters again. You compare headings, signatures, and dates, listening to the archive's ventilation while the difficult pages remain flat and still. Newspaper collections offer a different experience. Bound volumes open heavily, their pages broad and fragile, while microfilm machines cast pale rectangles across darkened rooms. You advance through September of 1922, one day at a time, seeing the story expand from a local report into national obsession. Headlines grow larger as certainty shrinks. The machine hums beside you, and each frame brings another layer of public invention. Reading coverage chronologically helps reveal when particular details entered common knowledge. A witness who later mentions a fact may have encountered it first in print, so publication dates become part of the evidence audit. You build a parallel timeline showing statement dates and newspaper appearances. The columns slowly align, and certain recollections become less independent than they initially seemed. This is detective work performed with a library lamp rather than a badge, but the required discipline is the same. The 1926 papers show how the Mirrors campaign shaped official momentum. Reports announce discoveries, demand action, and portray obstacles as signs of concealment. Rival newspapers respond with their own investigations, creating a feedback loop between press claims and state inquiries. You can hear reporters telephoning questions to witnesses who have just read about themselves. Information moves in circles, and the cold case researcher must identify where each circle first started. Trial transcripts slow that movement. Question and answer follow one another without the compression of headlines, revealing objections, qualifications, and moments when a witness admits uncertainty. You spend an hour on a few pages that newspapers reduce to one confident sentence. The work may feel drowsy, and that is useful. Patient investigation often advances when the reader remains with the dull wording long enough to notice what the exciting version left out. A headline may say Jane identified Francis, while the transcript shows extended questioning about distance, darkness, movement, and changing position. Another omission concerns the fingerprint, which appears decisive until handling history is included. You place the fuller versions beside the shorter ones, and the mystery becomes less theatrical, but more accurate. Under the archive lamp, truth often arrives as a careful reduction of certainty. Photographs demand similar restraint. Some images show the farm, courtroom, defendants, attorneys, or crowds, and each contains details not mentioned in text. Clothing, road width, tree spacing, and sight lines can be studied, yet photographs are framed by a person who chose where to stand and what to exclude. You use a magnifying glass along the margin, where a fence post or distant roof may help locate the camera more reliably than the central subject. Courtroom photographs preserve the extraordinary scale of the trial. Rows of reporters fill their tables. Spectators press into available seats, and Jane's hospital bed appears among the formal furniture. Looking quietly, you notice less famous details: cables crossing the floor, coats folded over chair backs, water glasses, and paper stacked beside counsel. These objects restore the long working hours behind the spectacle. Investigation, even when nationally watched, remains largely a matter of people sitting with documents. A modern reviewer might create digital copies and searchable text, allowing names and phrases to be compared across thousands of pages. Optical recognition would make mistakes with faded type, so every important result would still require visual confirmation. You type one unusual phrase into a search field, then return to the original image when several matches appear. Technology shortens the path to a page, but judgment must still read what the page actually says. Names require careful normalization. Henry Stevens may appear formally in one document and conversationally in another, while Jane Gibson may be identified through a married name, farm description, or newspaper nickname. Misspellings create false separations. You build a small index connecting each variation, and scattered references begin gathering around the correct person. This quiet clerical work lacks drama, yet without it, an important statement can remain hidden behind a single incorrect letter. Dates present their own problems. Newspapers sometimes describe events as yesterday, while later summaries assign a calendar date incorrectly. Testimony may refer to Thursday night without repeating the month and year. You keep a calendar from September of 1922 beside the transcript, checking weekdays against spoken dates. The paper calendar becomes one of our simplest tools, its orderly squares helping untangle memories expressed through relative time. Time of day must also be treated cautiously. Household clocks were not automatically synchronized, and witnesses may have estimated from meals, darkness, church bells, or streetcar schedules. A statement of 9 o'clock may mean several minutes on either side. You resist constructing a route that depends upon every clock being exact. Instead, the timeline uses ranges, leaving pale bands of possibility where earlier writers drew sharp points. Travel estimates require period conditions rather than modern roads. A present-day journey from Lavalette to New Brunswick cannot be used without adjusting for 1922 routes, surfaces, speed, and nighttime navigation. Historical road maps and automobile guides become evidence of practical possibility. You follow the older road line through towns and turns, feeling how much longer it is than the modern route, while the imagined headlights illuminate only a narrow strip ahead in the dark. Telephone records, where they survive, can anchor moments more securely, though they rarely provide the complete detail expected today. A switchboard operator may remember connecting a call, or household witnesses may confirm hearing one side of it. Billing information may show a long-distance connection without proving who spoke. You sit beside an imagined switchboard, cords crossing under small lights, and appreciate how much depended upon an operator's routine notation. Church records can clarify rehearsals, services, duties, and relationships, but they may also reflect the institution's wish to protect itself after scandal. Minutes tend to preserve official business rather than whispered concern. You read between entries without inventing what is absent. A choir rehearsal written in neat ink provides a date and place, while the emotional atmosphere surrounding it remains beyond the clerk's pen. Property records establish who controlled the Phillips farm and how the lane connected with neighboring land. They help answer whether the meeting place was secluded, accessible by car, or visible from nearby homes. Survey descriptions use measurements and landmarks that require translation into a map. You follow a boundary from stone to tree to road, hearing dry legal phrases reconstruct a landscape that photographs show only in fragments. Weather records add another quiet layer. Temperature, rainfall, cloud cover, and sunset time can inform the condition of the grass, road, and visibility. They cannot tell us who stood beneath the crabapple tree, but they can test claims about mud, moonlight, or open windows. You copy the observations from a regional station, then imagine the late summer air settling across the fields with the same impartial coolness. When all these materials are combined, the Hall Mills case becomes both clearer and more resistant. Certain popular claims weaken because their sources appear late or depend upon newspaper repetition. Other small details gain value because they were recorded early and independently. Yet no new pattern reaches the standard required to name a responsible person. You sit back from the crowded desk, not defeated, but reminded that better organization does not always produce a final answer. Still, there is another box to open, because patient detective work is not only about finding what was overlooked, it is also about understanding why earlier investigators made the choices they did. Their world contained different tools, expectations, hierarchies, and assumptions. You lift the next folder and find correspondence between officials, its formal salutations concealing irritation, uncertainty, and the pressure of a public waiting just beyond the office door. The correspondence reveals how authority moved unevenly between county offices during those first weeks. One official requests a statement already taken elsewhere, while another answers that the document hasn't yet been copied. Days can pass between request and reply, even when automobiles and telephones are available. You follow the dates stamped above each formal greeting, noticing how administrative delay settles into the Hall Mills investigation like fine dust. Some letters contain guarded complaints about cooperation, though the language remains courteous. No office wishes to admit that essential work has been neglected, especially while newspapers accuse everyone of incompetence or favoritism. A question sent across the county boundary may therefore receive an answer that protects the writer before it assists the inquiry. As you read, the paper crackles softly, and the polite phrases begin to feel heavier than their ordinary meaning. This does not mean every investigator was careless. Many worked long hours under difficult conditions, interviewing people repeatedly while reporters followed them from place to place. They inherited a contaminated scene and public expectations beyond anything a local office normally faced. You can imagine an exhausted detective removing his hat in a warm hallway, rubbing rain from the brim, and preparing to ask the same witness one more question. The trouble lay partly in coordination. No single person possessed every statement, photograph, exhibit, and medical finding from the beginning. Without one central file, contradictions might remain unnoticed, while rumors could reach one office before verified information arrived from another. You spread the surviving correspondence across our desk and see the inquiry moving in several directions at once. The movement looks energetic, but energy without shared structure can carry investigators farther from clarity. A patient review begins by rebuilding that structure. Every known document receives a date, author, recipient, and description, while copies are linked to their originals wherever possible. Statements are assigned version numbers, so a later retelling cannot quietly replace an earlier one. You work down the list with a sharpened pencil, hearing the low hum of the archive room, and the Hall Mills case slowly acquires an orderly skeleton. Next comes a complete evidence inventory. The letters from the farm, Edward's calling card, photographs, clothing records, medical reports, fingerprints, and maps must each be traced through surviving references. Some objects remain documented but physically unavailable. Others survive only as photographs or typed descriptions. You leave no blank unmarked because missing, destroyed, and location unknown are different conditions, and each has a different effect upon possible testing. The calling card deserves a particularly careful chain. Who first noticed it? Who picked it up? And whether gloves or clean paper were used, all matter to the fingerprint claim. Each person who handled the card creates another possible source of a mark. You copy the sequence into a separate notebook, though several portions remain uncertain. The card is small enough to rest inside your palm, yet its evidentiary history stretches through years of handling and argument. The scattered letters require the same attention. Reports differ about the number of pages found and whether visitors carried some away before officials established control. Newspaper photographs show paper on the grass, but not every sheet can be matched to a surviving exhibit. You compare margins, folds, and handwriting where images permit, while the faint scent of old photographic emulsion rises from a protective sleeve. The missing pieces remain part of the scene. An evidence inventory also exposes objects mentioned once and then forgotten. A handkerchief, key, spectacle case, watch, or scrap of paper may appear in an early report without returning at trial. Most such omissions have innocent explanations because not every personal item proves useful. Still, you trace each reference until it reaches a documented owner or a clear dead end. Patient investigation often advances through the unglamorous act of finding where ordinary objects went. The photographs are arranged according to camera position. Wide views establish the tree, lane, and neighboring fields, while closer images preserve clothing and paper placement. Shadows offer approximate direction, though the time of exposure may not be recorded precisely. You rotate a map until the angles agree. Then place small arrows where each photographer likely stood. For a moment, the vanished farm becomes a measured space rather than a remembered legend. From those positions, You estimate sightlines toward Jane Gibson's route. Trees and crops in September would have limited some views while leaving others more open. The height of corn matters, as does whether Jane remained mounted on Jenny or dismounted at any point. You avoid pretending the photographs answer everything, because many were taken after people had altered the field. Still, they narrow the range of what could have been seen from each place. Jane's route itself contains uncertainties. Her descriptions of following a wagon, approaching automobiles, and turning toward the farm vary across statements. A modern map makes the path appear simple, but the older property lines and tracks were less direct. You trace her movement slowly, hearing the mule's hooves strike packed earth and then soften over grass. Every turn changes the distance from the crabapple tree and the angle at which faces might become visible. The timing of the dog's barking also deserves review. Jane estimates the hour through household routine rather than a recorded clock observation, and later questions may have pushed her toward greater precision. Nearby witnesses report sounds or traffic at times that overlap only broadly. You create a window rather than a minute, allowing the event to float within reasonable limits. This wider interval feels less satisfying, but it more accurately reflects the surviving memory. Then you examine the words Jane says she heard, a woman's repeated protest, and the name Henry becomes central to the prosecution's theory. Yet sound across open fields can be deceptive. The name may have been spoken, misheard, or incorporated later from public discussion. You compare her earliest account with every subsequent version, circling the first appearance of each phrase. The pencil circles grow darker as the testimony becomes more specific. A linguistic comparison reveals another subtle pattern. Later statements sometimes adopt expressions used by interviewers or newspapers, which may indicate influence without deliberate invention. People naturally borrow familiar wording when telling a story repeatedly. You notice the same descriptive phrase in a headline and, days later, within a witness account. That overlap cannot prove contamination, but it warns us not to treat the later phrase as wholly independent. The investigators of 1922 understood witness influence in practical terms. Even without modern research on memory, they separated certain witnesses, repeated questions, and looked for corroboration. Though these precautions were inconsistently applied, reporters often reached people first or questioned them between official interviews. You can hear several voices asking for the same story on a farmhouse porch, while the witness gradually learns which details cause pencils to move most quickly. Money adds another complication. Newspapers sometimes paid for exclusive interviews, transportation, photographs, or information, practices accepted more readily in that era. Payment does not automatically make a statement false, but it creates an incentive for novelty and confidence. A modest witness may receive more attention in 1 week than throughout an entire life. You note every documented financial relationship, keeping it beside the testimony without allowing it to decide the testimony's truth. Jane's circumstances make this especially important. She lacked the wealth and legal protection surrounding the whole family, and newspaper attention may have offered both recognition and practical help. At the same time, she faced mockery and invasive scrutiny. We do not reduce her choices to greed or deception. You sit at her rough table in imagination, feeling cool air enter through imperfect boards, and consider how differently power appears from a small farm. Frances faced pressure from another direction. Every controlled response could be described as unnatural, while visible distress might be interpreted as guilt. Reporters watched her enter automobiles, attend hearings, and sit through private letters read aloud. There was no neutral expression available once the public had assigned her a role. You compare photographs taken seconds apart and see how easily one selected frame can support a writer's preferred description. An investigator must therefore remove demeanor from the center of analysis. Composure, tears, irritation, and unusual calm vary widely between people and situations. They may guide a question, but they cannot establish presence at the Phillips farm. You place the photographs back into their sleeve and return to travel times, witnesses, and physical objects. The glossy surface cools beneath your fingers, releasing us from the false certainty of a frozen face. The same rule applies to Willie's behavior. Courtroom sketches and articles treated his manner as entertainment, inviting readers to interpret personality as evidence. Yet, the actual inquiry required a plain account of where he was and what he touched. You strip away the adjectives from several reports, leaving only actions that can be checked. Once the language is cleaned, much of the supposed mystery surrounding him quietly disappears. Henry's marksmanship receives similar treatment. You write capability in one column and connection in another. Then note that the file demonstrates only the first. Many people in rural and coastal New Jersey knew how to use firearms. Without a recovered weapon or reliable placement at the scene, skill remains a background fact. You hear distant practice shots across an imagined shore range, each one separated from Russey's lane by many miles of road. Francis's access to automobiles also requires precision. Ownership or use of a car creates mobility, but does not show that a particular journey occurred. Investigators looked for witnesses along likely routes, mechanical signs, and household observations. The record offers disputed sightings, but no continuous path from her home to the farm and back. You follow the possible route, street by street, finding long sections where the map is filled only by assumption. License numbers would have helped, but witnesses generally did not record them. Descriptions such as dark, gray, old, or touring car fit many vehicles of the period. Headlamp shape and body style could narrow possibilities in daylight, though not reliably at night. You open an automobile catalogue from 1922, its pages smelling of old ink, and see how similar silhouettes emerge when reduced to a passing shape beneath weak light. Automobile sound may offer clues, but those recollections are even less exact. A witness might remember a motor laboring, a door closing, or tires moving over loose road material. Connecting that sound to one make or owner would be uncertain. You stand in the lane with your eyes closed and listen to an imagined engine approach, then fade toward New Brunswick. What remains afterward is atmosphere rather than identification, a low vibration dissolving into the night. The timeline of Francis's household is reconstructed from servants, relatives, calls, and searches made after Edward failed to return. Each person saw only part of the evening. One noticed a room occupied, another heard movement, and another recalled an automobile. You place their accounts on separate strips of paper, sliding them along the hours. They overlap in places but never form an unbroken chain, leaving intervals that support argument more readily than proof. The Mills household requires the same balanced treatment. James's account of Eleanor's departure, his later concern, and the contact with Francis must be aligned with independent observations. The children's memories deserve special caution because age and grief can shape later retellings. You avoid asking them to carry questions created by adults. In the imagined home, a lamp burns low, and a child hears conversations without understanding why every ordinary word has become important. One question concerns when the relationship became known to each spouse. The letters suggest secrecy, but secrecy can be partial. with people sensing a truth they avoid naming. Parish acquaintances may also have suspected without possessing direct knowledge. You create several levels on the page: known, suspected, rumored, and learned after discovery. This simple separation prevents us from treating community gossip as though it were a dated and witnessed disclosure. Another question concerns whether Edward and Eleanor intended to leave their marriages. Some passages can be read that way, while practical evidence of immediate departure appears limited. Their belongings, finances, and responsibilities do not clearly show a planned journey beginning that Thursday. Affectionate hopes may have offered emotional escape rather than a scheduled one. You close the letter gently and hear its folds settle, preserving the difference between imagined future and itinerary. If they expected only a private meeting, someone had to know or discover where it would occur. Perhaps the location was used before and observed by another person. Perhaps a message was intercepted, or one of them was followed. Investigators considered such possibilities, but never established the exact means. You draw 3 faint arrows toward the Phillips farm, each representing a route by which knowledge could travel, and none darkens into a proven line. The location's reputation as a meeting place complicates secrecy. De Russey's Lane offered privacy from city streets, yet it was not unknown or inaccessible. Couples, farmers, passers-by, and local residents used the surrounding roads. An unexpected encounter could occur without prior planning. You walk the lane slowly, feeling dust gather on your shoes, and notice how a secluded place can still belong to many people's ordinary geography. The arrangement at the tree suggests that whoever remained there had some time, though the length cannot be established. Scattered letters and personal objects made the relationship visible, perhaps intentionally. If the purpose was to expose, the person responsible may have understood the social consequences for both families. Yet exposure could also distract from another motive. You keep the word "message" in quotation marks, because investigators never proved precisely what the scene was meant to say. Newspaper writers preferred symbolic explanations, especially those connecting Eleanor's role as a singer with the treatment of her body. Such interpretations appeared powerful in print, but relied upon details we have chosen not to repeat. They also assumed a motive without evidence from the person responsible. You turn away from the lurid columns and return to measurable facts. The page still smells of old ink, but its dramatic certainty no longer controls our attention. Patient investigation often involves subtracting material rather than adding it. Every rumor removed from the working timeline makes the remaining evidence easier to see. A supposed confession without a named listener, a vehicle sighting reported years later, or a symbolic claim first printed by a tabloid receives less weight. You place these items in a contextual folder rather than discarding them, because even unreliable stories help explain how the public version of Hall Mills formed. One rumor claims that a participant privately admitted knowledge after receiving money. Another suggests that an official was paid to leave New Jersey. The details shift according to the teller, and documentary support remains uneven. Some allegations were examined during the 1926 proceedings without producing a stable evidentiary chain. You record who repeated each claim and when, then stop the rumor from traveling backward into the original file as though it had always been there. The official correspondence sometimes shows how rumor influenced priorities. A prosecutor receives several letters about a sensational allegation and assigns investigators to check it, while quieter leads wait. Public pressure can consume limited time, even when officials doubt the claim. You imagine a desk covered with telegrams, each demanding immediate action, and understand why method becomes difficult when every envelope arrives marked urgent. Anonymous letters contribute further noise. Famous cases attract people who confess falsely, accuse neighbors, offer dreams as evidence, or claim special knowledge without verifiable detail. The Hall Mills inquiry received communications of this general kind, requiring someone to read and classify them. You open one unsigned page only long enough to identify whether it contains a checkable fact. Most do not, and the paper returns to a folder labeled unsubstantiated. A useful lead must contain information not publicly known and capable of independent confirmation. This standard sounds simple, yet sensational coverage made non-public details scarce. Newspapers printed maps, letters, testimony, and photographs, giving almost anyone the vocabulary of an insider. You search the publication timeline before evaluating each supposed revelation. If the fact appeared in print first, the confession loses much of its evidentiary value. The same problem confronts later writers who interview descendants or elderly residents. Family stories may preserve genuine information, but they also absorb books, radio programs, and community folklore. A statement beginning with, "My father always said," needs a date, setting, and explanation of how the father could know. You listen respectfully, without promising more than the account can support. Oral history is precious, though its texture differs from sworn contemporary evidence. Radio gives the case another life in later decades. Local broadcasts revisit the names, roads, and courtroom personalities for listeners who remember the trial or heard about it from parents. Recordings preserved by the New Brunswick Library capture not only facts, but the rhythm of regional memory. You hear an announcer's older microphone soften each consonant, while tape turns with a faint mechanical hiss beneath the spoken story. Listening to such broadcasts helps identify when certain popular claims became established. A detail absent from early records may appear confidently in a mid-century program and then enter later books without citation. You note the broadcast date and follow the claim backward until its trail ends. Sometimes the source is a newspaper column, sometimes an interview, and sometimes nothing identifiable. The detective's work resembles tracing a stream toward a spring that may never have existed. Books bring longer arguments. Authors select evidence, interview surviving participants, and propose explanations shaped by their era. One emphasizes class privilege, another institutional failure, and another a previously neglected group or suspect. Each can preserve valuable information, while also imposing a pattern. You read the notes and appendices before accepting the narrative, because sources reveal whether a confident paragraph rests upon a document, a recollection, or the author's own inference. Theories involving organized moral enforcement reflect the social climate of the early 1920s, when public campaigns against perceived vice carried real influence. Yet historical plausibility is not case-specific proof. You examine membership activity, public statements, and local events, looking for a direct connection to Edward, Eleanor, or the farm. The records may establish presence in the region while leaving the Hall Mills case untouched by any verifiable link. Theories involving a spontaneous confrontation face a different difficulty. They can explain why no elaborate plan or preserved communication appears, but they require an unrecorded encounter and an unknown participant. A chance meeting is possible precisely because the lane was accessible. Yet possibility alone can multiply endlessly. You write each version in one sentence, then ask what unique evidence it predicts. Without such evidence, the theory remains a story-shaped space. The whole family theory predicts coordinated travel, knowledge of the meeting, and later protection among relatives. Investigators searched for these elements and found circumstances they believed suggestive, but the jury did not find them sufficient. A modern review would need genuinely new proof rather than a more persuasive retelling. You place the 1926 prosecution beside later versions and notice how often later writers simply strengthen the verbs without strengthening the evidence. A theory involving James Mills predicts knowledge, opportunity, and a route from his home to the farm. His financial position and emotional circumstances are sometimes used as substitutes for those missing elements. We refuse that substitution. You check the earliest timeline again, then return to his statements about searching and contacting Francis. The gaps remain, but gaps belong to almost everyone in the file, and they do not select one person by themselves. A theory involving an unknown third party must explain the letters and deliberate arrangement, which suggest at least some knowledge of the relationship. An entirely random encounter appears less compatible with those details, though an unexpected person could still discover them at the scene. You weigh accessibility against intimacy, feeling the two considerations balance without settling. The crabapple tree remains at the center, its low branches covering more possibilities than the file can separate. For a modern cold case team, hypothesis testing would proceed without ranking suspects by fame. Each theory would receive the same questions about motive, means, opportunity, predicted evidence, and contradictions. You create a grid and mark known facts only. Several theories fit broad circumstances, but each fails at least one crucial connection. The empty cells are not invitations to guess. They are a record of what further evidence would need to show. DNA testing naturally comes to mind, but the whole Mills evidence presents formidable obstacles. The scene involved 2 victims, numerous visitors, officials, medical personnel, and years of uncertain handling. Any biological material would require provenance strong enough to distinguish meaningful contact from contamination. You cannot simply swab an old object and treat the resulting profile as an answer. Before opening an evidence package, the laboratory would need a documented and carefully limited question. The known whereabouts of original physical exhibits are also uncertain. Archival collections largely preserve papers and copies, while objects used in court may have remained in official storage, been returned, deteriorated, or disappeared. A serious review would begin by contacting every relevant custodian and comparing inventories across decades. You make those requests in imagination, hearing keys turn in old evidence rooms where labels have faded to the color of cardboard. If an object were found, its packaging would be examined before the object itself. Seals, handwriting, dates, and storage conditions could reveal whether contamination risk is manageable. Photographs might confirm that the package matches a trial exhibit. You place it beneath cool laboratory light and resist opening it until every exterior detail has been recorded. Patience at this stage protects the little information that time may have left intact. Latent fingerprints might also be reconsidered with modern imaging, though the calling card's handling history would remain a serious limitation. Enhanced images could clarify whether Faurot's comparison was technically sound, but they could not determine when Willie touched the surface. Improved resolution does not answer every historical question. You see the ridges emerge more clearly on a screen, while the date of contact remains as distant and silent as ever. Document examination could study ink, paper, folds, and sequence, potentially distinguishing original letters from copies or later editions. It might also reveal whether torn pieces came from the same sheet. Yet much of this work would illuminate the scene, rather than identify the responsible person. You fit two irregular paper edges together beneath magnification, and the reunion feels satisfying, even though it closes only a very small part of the file. Geographic information systems could reconstruct the farm, roads, homes, and sightlines more precisely. Historical maps, property surveys, and photographs would provide layers, while period vegetation and terrain estimates add uncertainty. You rotate the digital model toward Jane's claimed position and reduce the light to approximate Thursday evening. Shapes remain visible, but individual recognition changes with every assumption, reminding us that a model is an argument expressed through space. Acoustic modeling might estimate whether a name could carry between locations, though wind, vegetation, voice level, and background noise are poorly documented. The result would offer ranges rather than a verdict. You listen through headphones as a simulated voice crosses the reconstructed field, becoming thinner with distance. It may show that hearing was possible, but it cannot establish what Jane heard in 1922 or how accurately she remembered it later. A timeline database could bring the greatest practical benefit. Every statement, call, citing, and official action could be entered with confidence levels and source links. Contradictions would appear immediately, while unsupported assertions would remain visibly separate. You click from a witness name to the earliest transcript, then to a later newspaper interview. The technology doesn't solve the Hall Mills case, but it prevents the researcher from losing the path between claim and source. This source discipline matters because the case has accumulated more than a century of retelling. A minor error can pass from one book to another until repetition resembles confirmation. Dates shift, relationships simplify, and uncertain descriptions become fixed facts. You trace one claim through several publications and discover that all depend upon the same unverified column. The stack looked substantial from a distance, yet at its base rests only one fragile page. The people themselves also become flattened by repetition. Edward is remembered almost entirely through the relationship, though his years as a rector contained many ordinary duties and connections. Eleanor becomes a voice from the choir and a writer of letters, while her life as a mother receives less attention. You pause beside their separate records and restore small dimensions where possible, not to excuse choices, but to preserve their full humanity. Edward's education, parish work, household habits, and relationships with congregants help explain his daily movements. A rector's schedule could include visits, correspondence, meetings, and unexpected calls, making an evening absence initially plausible. You examine church notices and local reports, hearing doors open and close around a working parish. The collar that made him nationally recognizable was first part of a routine vocation lived one day at a time. Eleanor's choir participation required rehearsal, familiarity with music, and repeated cooperation with others. Singing is both public and intimate, especially within a small church where voices become distinguishable. You imagine her holding a worn score, breathing with the people beside her, and watching for the conductor's hand. Those quiet details matter because they place her before the case, within a community that knew more of her than any headline could contain. James's work as sexton also deserves ordinary context. He attended to heating, cleaning, bells, locks, and countless practical needs that made worship possible. His position placed him close to Edward while preserving a sharp difference in status. You feel the weight of an iron key ring and smell coal or floor polish in a side passage, where daily labor continued beneath the more visible life of the sanctuary. Francis's wealth and family standing shaped the investigation, but they did not eliminate personal complexity. Her marriage, household responsibilities, and reliance upon her brothers formed a private world examined mostly through hostile public attention. You look beyond the courtroom photographs toward letters and domestic records, seeking evidence rather than caricature. Class may explain access to attorneys and respectful treatment, but it cannot tell us what she knew on one September evening. The brothers also had lives beyond the prosecution's theory. Henry's Shaw connections and interests, Willie's dependence and routines, and Carpenter's place within the extended family require factual description before inference. The press preferred compact character sketches because they were easier to remember. You restore dates and ordinary activities beneath those sketches, allowing each person to return from a role into a human being with a broader life. This restoration is not separate from investigation. When people are reduced to types, detectives may ask only the questions that fit the assigned role. A jealous spouse, eccentric brother, poor husband, or unreliable farm woman becomes a ready explanation rather than a person whose actual movements must be proved. You cross out those labels and write the names again. The file feels calmer afterward, and its remaining facts stand in cleaner air. The social divide between the Hall and Mills households nevertheless influenced every stage. Francis could summon prominent counsel and occupy spaces where officials behaved carefully, while James and his children possessed fewer protections against intrusion. Jane's poverty made mockery easier, and Pearl's youth made exploitation easier. You mark these inequalities without turning them into proof. They shaped how evidence was collected and received, which is different from determining who was responsible. Gender expectations shaped the story as well. Francis's restraint and Eleanor's letters were interpreted through rigid ideas about wives, desire, and proper feeling. Jane's assertiveness made her vulnerable to ridicule, while Pearl's presence on the lane attracted moral judgment unrelated to the discovery. You read the coverage with these pressures in mind, seeing how easily character accusation enters a case through social expectation rather than evidence. Religious expectations added another layer. Edward's role as a rector made the relationship a public contradiction, and Eleanor's place in the choir intensified the perceived scandal. Some people may have felt betrayed, while others sought to protect the church's reputation. Investigators needed to distinguish moral outrage from actionable knowledge. You sit again in the quiet sanctuary, where afternoon light colors the floor, and notice how institutions often respond to shame by choosing silence. That silence may explain incomplete early statements from parish members. A witness could protect Edward's memory, Eleanor's children, the church, or a personal friendship without knowing anything about the deaths. Withholding embarrassment is not the same as concealing a crime, though it can delay useful context. You compare hesitant answers with later admissions and see people gradually acknowledging the relationship once public secrecy becomes impossible. The change reveals social pressure more clearly than guilt. Investigators in the first days had to navigate all these sensitivities while pursuing immediate facts. Every interview risked becoming a headline, and every respectful pause could be called favoritism. Their mistakes were real, particularly at the farm and in record control, yet hindsight sees paths that were hidden amid the noise. You allow them neither easy excuse nor easy condemnation. The old correspondence smells faintly of dust and effort, and both belong to its history. One letter describes a request for additional questioning after a witness's account appeared in print. Another seeks confirmation of a vehicle said to have been seen near the lane. A third asks where certain papers have been placed. None offers a decisive clue, but together they show investigators responding to a case whose boundaries kept expanding. You read until the formal handwriting becomes familiar, as though the officials themselves were seated at neighboring desks. The tone changes when public criticism intensifies. Replies become firmer, and officials defend actions taken during the first hours. Some blame reporters and crowds, while reporters blame authorities for failing to protect the scene. Both complaints contain truth. You can hear the argument passing between officers, while the actual field lies beyond them, already altered beyond recovery. The crabapple tree becomes almost an absent participant, holding what no institution managed to preserve. A patient detective reviewing institutional failure asks what procedure would prevent repetition. Immediate scene control, one evidence custodian, shared reporting, recorded interviews, and a unified command would answer many early problems. These ideas are standard now because cases like Hall Mills demonstrated their need through painful example. You write them in the margin without imagining that procedure alone guarantees success. Even a perfectly guarded scene can remain difficult, but disorder makes difficulty far deeper. Training also matters. Local officers rarely encountered a case attracting national press and involving 2 counties, prominent families, and hundreds of curious visitors. They had no prepared media perimeter or large forensic team. You picture a few officials facing a field full of people, trying to establish authority while automobiles continue arriving. The sound of voices swells around them, and each passing minute carries another unrecorded footprint into the grass. The coroner's role reflects another period difference. Medical and investigative responsibilities varied by jurisdiction, and professional standards were less uniform than today. Findings could be shaped by limited facilities, hurried transport, and disagreement over authority. You study the typed medical copies for dates and signatures, avoiding unnecessary detail. The pages feel cool beneath the archival weight, their formal phrases unable to recover what the earliest examination failed to document. Photography was valuable, but not comprehensive. No continuous series captures every approach, footprint, and object before disturbance. Exposure limitations and equipment weight shaped what could be recorded. You imagine the photographer unfolding a tripod while spectators edge closer, curious about the black-covered camera. Each plate preserves a narrow view, and between those views lie spaces that later investigators can only reconstruct through testimony. Fingerprint work was advancing rapidly, and experts like Faurot carried considerable authority. Yet public faith in a new science could exceed its proper reach, especially when jurors saw enlarged patterns without a full understanding of collection history. The Hall Mills card illustrates this gap between identification and interpretation. You study the loops once more, then write beneath them. Even a correct match must answer the right question. Ballistic comparison also existed in developing form, but without a recovered weapon, its usefulness was sharply limited. The medical evidence could describe projectiles and direction without connecting them securely to one owner. Later advances could not compensate if the relevant materials were lost or inadequately preserved. You open an empty evidence listing and feel the frustration of a tool waiting for an object that never arrives at the laboratory. Transportation records were scattered among licensing offices, garages, dealers, and private owners. Investigators could canvass them, though every passing day weakened recollection. A mechanic might remember unusual work only after knowing which car mattered. You visit an imagined garage where oil darkens the concrete and tools hang against a wooden wall, asking whether a familiar vehicle arrived after Thursday night. The answer, if uncertain then, cannot become firmer through time. Household telephones provided clues, without automatic logs. Operators, servants, and family members became the record, each remembering calls through ordinary routine. A connection made late at night might stand out, but content depended upon whoever overheard it. You follow one reported call through several statements and find its time shifting slightly. The bell remains clear in memory, while the exact minute softens around the edges. Mail offered another possible path. If Edward and Eleanor arranged meetings through letters, envelopes, delivery times, and intercepted correspondence might reveal knowledge. Yet many messages were destroyed, carried privately, or removed from their original sequence. You study postmarks where they survive, hearing a sorting room's soft thump and rustle. Each envelope confirms movement between hands, though not every hand along that route was ever identified. Church messages could travel verbally through rehearsals or household staff, leaving no physical record. A simple request to meet might pass through someone who understood only its surface meaning. Later questioning could overlook that person if investigators assumed a letter or telephone call. You return to the parish network and search for messengers, secretaries, and people who routinely carried notes. Their ordinary service placed them near information, without necessarily making them aware. This possibility widens the circle considerably. The more people who could know of the meeting, the less confidently investigators can restrict suspicion to either spouse. Yet widening without evidence produces an unmanageable list. You therefore ask which individuals had both specific knowledge and unexplained opportunity. Most names fall away under that test, while a small group remains only because the record is incomplete, not because evidence points toward them. The distinction between not excluded and supported becomes essential. Many people cannot now be excluded because their movements were never documented fully. That condition does not make them plausible suspects. You write the two phrases on separate cards and keep them visible throughout the review. The first describes a limit in the file. The second describes affirmative evidence. Confusing them would turn historical uncertainty into unfair accusation. Private correspondence among attorneys shows that this distinction was understood during the trial. Defense lawyers repeatedly emphasized how the prosecution used absence as implication, while Simpson argued that circumstances combined into proof. Their disagreement remains the central legal tension of Hall Mills. You read the arguments in their longer form, hearing pens scratch and papers shift as each side prepares. Beneath the rhetoric lies a shared awareness that direct evidence was painfully scarce. Juror recollections, where later reported, must also be approached carefully. A juror speaking after the trial may explain which weakness mattered personally, though memory and public reaction can shape the account. The verdict itself is reliable. Individual reasoning is less fully preserved. You avoid inventing a unified discussion behind the closed door. We know the outcome, the duration, and the evidence before them, but not every sentence exchanged across that table. The acquittal changed the file's future. Double jeopardy protected those tried from being prosecuted again for the same charge, even if public suspicion continued. Any later official theory would therefore require careful legal consideration, especially if it implicated an acquitted defendant. You close the trial volume gently, recognizing that law preserves finality even when history remains uncertain. The binding makes a soft sound, like a door settling into its frame. Henry Carpenter's untried position differed, though the state's evidence against him shared many weaknesses exposed in the joint case. Proceeding separately would have required prosecutors to present disputed testimony again after the central theory failed. The charge was not pursued to another verdict, You place his name within a separate legal column, preserving the procedural difference while refusing to interpret the absence of trial as either proof or vindication. As decades passed, the practical possibility of a new prosecution diminished. Witnesses died, exhibits vanished, and memories lost their original context. Even a newly discovered statement would need corroboration strong enough to survive questions about delay. You watch the calendar pages turn through the archive, each year reducing one kind of access, while increasing historical distance. The case moves gradually from active legal matter toward enduring record. The families also pass through generations. Children become adults, relatives die, and descendants inherit clippings or stories without choosing them. Some preserve documents, while others prefer distance from public speculation. A respectful investigator approaches them for records, not performances, and accepts boundaries when private grief outweighs historical curiosity. You imagine a family envelope resting in a drawer for 50 years, its contents known only through a penciled name on the front. Occasionally, such private material can clarify a minor point. A dated letter may place someone away from New Brunswick, confirm when a rumor began, or show what a family believed at the time. It may also contain nothing about the case, despite hopeful expectations. You open each item slowly and read without searching every domestic phrase for hidden meaning. Ordinary life continued around the mystery, and most surviving paper belongs to that ordinary life. Genealogical records help distinguish relatives whose similar names created confusion in later accounts. Birth, marriage, residence, and death records establish who lived where and when. These are quiet documents, filled with clerical handwriting and stamped dates. You follow one branch of the Stevens family across several pages, discovering that a supposed witness was actually elsewhere or belonged to another household. Accuracy sometimes arrives through a ledger rather than a dramatic clue. City directories offer equally modest help. They list occupations, addresses, spouses, and businesses, allowing us to reconstruct neighborhoods around the Hall and Mills homes. You turn thin pages printed in narrow columns, tracing walking distances to the church and streetcar lines. The city begins to regain its 1922 scale. Places described vaguely as nearby become measured blocks, while others prove farther apart than later retellings suggest. Sanborn maps add building outlines, property materials, alleyways, and outbuildings. They can show whether a witness's claimed view crossed an open yard or passed through several structures. You lay one colored sheet beside a directory and align the street names. Red and yellow building shapes create a quiet, geometric city, and within it, the movements of Thursday evening become slightly more constrained. Census records provide household composition before the case. Servants, relatives, lodgers, and neighbors may appear there, helping identify people mentioned only by surname in testimony. You find an individual who seemed peripheral and learn that she lived within hearing distance of a relevant telephone. This does not transform her into a suspect, but it clarifies why investigators questioned her. Context restores the logic behind an old interview. Employment records and newspaper notices can establish work schedules. A shop closing time, church meeting, coastal engagement, or household duty may narrow a witness's opportunity. Each item alone is slight, yet together they strengthen or weaken a timeline. You collect them as a watchmaker collects tiny gears, aware that one misplaced piece can stop the mechanism from keeping dependable time. The patient nature of this work contrasts sharply with the original coverage. Headlines promised sudden resolution, while archival reconstruction advances by fractions. One corrected address changes, a walking estimate, One earlier statement lowers confidence in a later identification. You may spend an afternoon confirming that a commonly repeated time was wrong by half an hour. The discovery is quiet, but it removes an entire route once treated as possible. Another afternoon may show that two apparently independent witnesses spoke with the same reporter before approaching police. Their agreement then carries less corroborative force because information could have passed between them. You draw a line connecting their interviews and see the witness network change shape. Nothing new has been added, yet the weight of old testimony has shifted through better understanding of how the accounts formed. This is what it feels like to investigate the Hall Mills case after the crowds have gone. There is no chase, only the slow comparison of paper against paper, map against memory, and claim against source. The archive clock moves almost silently while daylight fades across the reading table. You become aware of your own breathing and the weight of the folder beneath one hand, both steady enough to accompany the long work. At closing time, the archivist brings a foam support and helps secure the oldest volume. You return each page to its folder in the order found, because preserving sequence is part of preserving meaning. The box closes without drama. Outside, traffic passes through a New Brunswick landscape Edward and Eleanor would scarcely recognize, while the church, county lines, and names remain attached to the same unresolved history. But one packet still waits inside the correspondence box, tied separately and marked with dates from the weeks immediately after the discovery. Its pages concern the officials who returned to de Russey's Lane after the crowds thinned, hoping the altered ground might still yield something overlooked. You loosen the cotton tie carefully, and the smell of old paper rises once more as their measured search begins to take shape beneath the lamp. The pages describe careful footsteps through flattened grass, measurements taken after too many others had passed, and questions asked when the clearest answers were already beyond reach. You can feel the officials trying to recover order from the altered field, recording what remained beneath the crabapple tree, without pretending they could restore its first untouched silence. Their notes end plainly, with no overlooked object strong enough to repair the losses of those early hours. More than a century later, no one has ever been convicted of the deaths of Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills. Francis Hall, Willie Stevens, and Henry Stevens were acquitted. The case against Henry Carpenter was never brought to trial, and no later evidence established another person's guilt. The Hall Mills case remains officially unsolved, its answer never secured by the investigators, jurors, journalists, or patient researchers who returned to it through the years. You can set the packet down now and loosen the cotton tie from your fingers while the archive room grows cooler and the last light withdraws from the table. Nothing more is required from you tonight. The witnesses have said all that survives. The maps have carried us as far as their old roads allow, and the paper can rest once again within its quiet box. Beyond the windows, New Brunswick settles beneath an evening sky, and traffic passes where fields once opened toward de Russey's Lane. The crabapple tree is gone, though its place remains faintly marked in records, memory, and the patient work of people who refuse to treat uncertainty carelessly. We leave Edward and Eleanor with their names restored, not as characters in an old spectacle, but as two lives still deserving of kindness. The file stays closed beneath the small lamp, and the night asks nothing further of you now, except to let the unanswered field grow quiet and rest.